Good morning. Thank you for coming in on a beautiful day after a fairly alarming storm. We're very happy to have you all here today, and a few thank yous just to kick this off. We're very grateful to the New York Council on the Arts for their support. An extraordinary number of people supported this exhibition, including Oeuvre, who's here with us today. Tom and Lisa Blumenthal were behind this symposium, which will lead to a book that we're very excited about. But most of all, I want to thank the people here at DIA. Béatrice Gross has been an extraordinary collaborator on this exhibition, and we're very grateful for her work and her thinking. It will continue, as I say, over the coming months. Those of you who have not spent time in the exhibition, please head downstairs and have another view. It's open all today, of course. Béatrice is also working on the book, which will be forthcoming in about a year from now. I also want to thank Megan Whitco, who's done an incredible job working on the exhibition with Béatrice on the symposium and also on the future publication. You've done an astounding job so far, and we're looking forward to seeing what unfolds in the coming months. Thanks, Max, as ever. None of our symposium and talks would happen without you. And Mary Catherine, who's hidden away over there, who manages everything expertly. A huge thank you to the Morellet family. Florent's with us today. It's been a pleasure working with all of you, Florent, and I only wish Danielle and Frique were with us as well, but it's great to have had your presence throughout this whole exhibition. This symposium, as all public talks at DIA, are part of the Sackler program at DIA. I'm going to hand over to Courtney, who'll be introducing our speakers for this morning. Thank you.
Hi. We are pleased to welcome our speakers here today. Though I will offer brief introductions for the sake of time, each is extremely accomplished and will bring new ideas to bear on the work of François Morellet. Our first speaker is Alexander Alberro, the Virginia Bloedel Wright Professor of Art History at Barnard College and Columbia University. His most recent book, Abstraction in Reverse, The Reconfigured Spectator in Mid-20th Century Latin American Art, traces Latin American art as it evolved across South America and parts of Europe. Our second speaker is Valerie Hillings, the curator and associate director of curatorial affairs for the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum's Abu Dhabi project. Her last exhibition, The Great Zero, Countdown to Tomorrow, the first large-scale historical survey in the US of the artist group Zero. Our third speaker will be Daniel Levin Becker, who is a critic, editor, translator, and member of the Oeuvre de Littérature Potentielle, or ULIPO, a loose francophone workshop that utilizes the literary device of constrained writing technique. Béatrice Gross will be our final presenter for today. She is an independent curator and art critic based in New York and in Paris. Béatrice comes to us as the organizer of François Morellet at DIA Chelsea. It is on view, as Jessica just told us, at 545 West 22nd Street. I hope that you have a chance to see it. Finally, I regret to tell you that artist John Armleder was not able to attend the symposium. His travel plans were derailed by yesterday's weather. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you. Let me just get this in order. And I also would like to begin by thanking Béatrice Gross in particular, but also Courtney Martin for the invitation, Megan Whitco for everything she's done, and Jessica Morgan for everything she's doing at the DIA. So I've titled this paper François Morellet's Concrete Art of the 1950s. And I begin by observing that when sometime between 1949 and 1950, François Morellet abandoned figurative painting, which I'm show you a couple examples of that work here. He was faced with the problem of what to design, what to render. I think I have another example. So what to design, what to render, what to make. Get rid of figurative painting, and a lot of questions emerge. He also began to ask himself what might transpire once semiosis when semiosis itself is left behind. For many other young painters in France at the time, all that remained once they renounced representation was a spontaneous form of self-expression, and they alternately turned to the lyrical abstraction of tachisme or to the tragic pathos of art informel. But evidently, that type of response those types of responses were insufficient for Morellet. Neither tachisme nor art informel, but figuration also had to go. The thoroughgoing emphasis that any form of gestural painting or sculpture placed on the subjectivity of production was too narrative and too romantic for him. Morellet quickly discovered that when one renounces depiction or traditional modes of representation, one doesn't thereby jettison form, structure, and content. Many of his early non-figurative paintings were not any more or less expressive than others in art history's vast repertoire. But they were more abstract, or more concrete, if you want. If by concrete we mean that they were asemiotic, without the support marks that can more or less easily be taken to be either a deformation of something in the world, as in Cubism, or a visual language or code that by convention represents or intervenes in the world, as in, say, Surrealism or German Expressionism and the like. The paintings that Morellet began to produce in the 1950s required a mutation in the grammar of looking. It was no longer possible to ask what these particular depictions look like, since depictionless art looks like itself. Quite how radical, how giddying, and even disturbing this was, I think, can be felt more than 2/3 of a century later in the Morellet show downstairs here at Dia. Now, once depiction no longer reigns, once non-representational art becomes the working method of production, especially when human gesture is avoided, all the questions that any artistic practice must ask, no matter what its era, suddenly land like a ton of bricks before the artist. How does one start once representation is rendered obsolete? Once you're no longer representing figuratively, where do you begin? How does one start? Where does one start? How does one stop? When do you decide that, okay, enough now? When does one stop? What size or scale does one work in? Which pigments and materials and supports does one fill the entire surface or area with? How dense should the pictorial space be? What should one use to apply the pigment? Does one use a brush, a roller, fingers, a squeegee, or to sculpt or otherwise shape the material? How much should one intervene in the production process? Does one extend the composition beyond the conventional virtual space or temporal framework defined by tradition? Now, Morellet found various different ways of answering some of these questions. They were obviously all questions that he had to answer, while warding off many other questions. But perhaps the most pressing question his new working method would throw up concerned the relationship the artwork should establish with its public. Or to put that another way, what model of subject-object relations should be developed? Before the crisis of representation that took place in the early 20th century, no visual artist would have been too concerned with this question. When there was depicted content, the spectator's role was much more clearly defined, and indeed had been fine-tuned since the 15th century. But once the picture space, once the space of figuration became contentless, that 20th century invention, the question of spectatorship took on a different complexion. Addressing Morellet's turn to abstraction, scholars have often noted, going through the literature, scholars have often noted the artist's discovery of Melanesian tapas, bark cloths, in the Musée de l'Homme in Paris at around the same time, or his encounter with the decorations of the Alhambra in Granada in Spain in 1952, associations, I might add, that Morellet himself encouraged. There's also been a lot of discussion about Morellet's interactions with U.S. artists Ellsworth Kelly and Jack Youngerman during these years. Yet, the early trips that he made to Brazil seem to have been equally, if not more, consequential on the development of his artistic practice, I want to argue. When Morellet first traveled to Rio de Janeiro in 1950, a location that at the time he was considering making his new home, he was quickly caught up in the fascination with concrete art that had already gripped that country's artistic scene. Max Bill's highly touted retrospective at the Sao Paulo Museum of Art that year had just closed when Morellet arrived in Brazil, and many local artists were still raving about Bill's geometric vocabulary and the clarity and order his art made evident. Concrete art would predominate in the Brazilian art world in the 1950s until people broke with concrete art, until people killed Bill and made neo-concrete art. But in the 1950s, concrete art was the doxa within the context of Brazil in that decade. Now, the Rio de Janeiro-based artist Almir Mavigné, who Morellet seems to have befriended quite rapidly upon his initial visit to Brazil, and who would remain an important interlocutor of Morellet's for many years to come, and was at the time developing work that took up those aspects of Max Bill's production that concerned perceptual investigation, became very important in this context. These are related to Gestalt tendencies, to the Gestalt tendencies that Mavigné and his associates, such as Abraham Palatnik and Ivan Serpa, as well as the critic Mario Pedrosa, who were all in Rio at the time, working, very interestingly, in the hospital there, in the 1949, 1950, they were doing art therapy in a hospital in Rio, all three of them, which is fabulously interesting because Mavigné goes on to be one of the key members, joins the School of Design and becomes a key member of that concrete art. Ivan Serpa will go on to found the Groupe Frente, which leads to neo-concretism, and the third figure in that troika, Abraham Palatnik, will be key for the development of kinetic art. I mean, in the post-war period. So it's a very interesting incubation moment there within the context of Rio that Morellet walks into in 1950 at a moment when he's thinking of moving his family to Rio. Is that correct?
Yep.
So Mavigné and within that context was also Mario Pedrosa, the key critic. He was the Greenberg of Brazil. He was a key critic. I mean, I hate to draw that kind of parallel, but he was a very important critic within the context of Brazil. And he'd written a doctoral thesis on Gestalt. So this Gestalt theory was fundamental to what these people were figuring, to the discussions. These figures saw in Bill's concrete art the image on the plastic form that's a fully anticipated image, a proto-image, and is above or at least outside of the realm of sense experience. art from this perspective, from this concrete perspective, was a means of communicating knowledge, though plainly visible, knowledge that, though plainly visible, had hitherto been inaccessible. So art is a kind of almost scientific investigation, or as an investigation of knowledge possibilities, mathematical knowledge, physical knowledge, knowledges that can only be communicated through visual form, shall we say. Now, although it denied all forms of naturalism, the central task of Max Bill's concrete art was the elucidation of natural phenomena. This led directly to an interest in mathematics and physics as the basis for how art stipulates the human senses. The latter could be measured as quantities, and the quantification forms the basis for perception. Yet what's perceived is conditioned by a whole layer of what itself seems to escape perception, the rationalism that codified the cultural techniques involved in the production of the artwork. And this will be a running thesis of mine through the paper, namely that perception is coded as perception and conception together, and the two are in the kind of, one needs to mediate the other within this model of cognition, or this model of vision, if you want. Now, Morellet remained in Brazil until early 1951, but revealingly, they returned in early 1951, but revealingly returned to the South American country as soon as he could that same summer. So he went back to meet with Mavigné and to touch. By that point, it wasn't a matter of moving there anymore. By that point, it was a matter of retouching base with people that he had begun a conversation with. So he returns later in 1951 to Brazil and continued the conversation with Mavigné. Mavigné, by the way, is the figure who, he was the person who introduced Morellet to Ellsworth Kelly or to Jack Youngerman in the early 1950s. By the end of 1951, Morellet was painting geometric works with simple pared down forms, such as I show you here. Concrete art, or at least the variant of it that was dominant in Brazil in the mid-20th century, maintained that both expression and figuration were obsolete, and that only by streamlining form and arriving at an art of clarity, stability, and order could the current artistic problems be resolved. Canvases had to be understood only as planes, as defined spaces, and compositions as experiments of interdependencies. Parallel to Mavigné and the concrete artists that he had met in Brazil at the time, and here I'm showing you a 1951 photograph of Morellet with Mavigné and another important Brazilian concrete artist, Geraldo de Barros, who he was also in dialogue with, obviously. Parallel to Mavigné and the concrete artists that he had met in Brazil at the time, Morellet seems to have adopted these concerns and adhered to them quite methodically, I might add. The process of production of the French artist's paintings over the next few years began to follow general a priori axioms. All traces of the artist's subjective intervention were purged, and the canvases functioned as a means of conceptually deducible configurations. Rejecting all varieties and hybrids of naturalism, let alone any form of hedonistic non-figurativism that seeks the mere excitement of pleasure or displeasure, Morellet's paintings now functioned as a means of knowledge logically drawn from concepts, above opinion, and demanding for its review a previous epistemology. They limited the role of the spectator to that of rationally analyzing the properties of the fully determinate work, thereby desubjectivizing the spectator's personal perspective in order to arrive at a completely detached and unambiguous understanding of the proposition. It's a kind of decoding the spectator as a reader of the logic that went into the making of the image. That the underlying logic of Morellet's new painting was homologous with Bill's aesthetic program was not by chance. Morellet adopted the Swiss artist's mechanistic production methods and his geometric vocabulary, as well as the empiricist conception of the interaction between the artwork and the spectator that he advocated. Morellet traveled with Mavigné to the School of Design in Germany to meet Bill, first in 1954 and then again in 1956. Assuming Max Bill's method of concrete art production, Morellet came to understand art as a type of instrument, a functional guide for the exploration of perception. Painting for him now became a purely intellectual, abstract procedure with clear organizing principles. Objectivity, verifiability, predictability became the crucial components of his artistic practice as it searched for fixed values of spatial form. The earliest of Morellet's non-representational canvases worked with systematic repetition of simple geometric forms or elements in black and white on a flat surface. The paintings are entirely constructed through a meticulously calculated coordination of pictorial elements across the surface plane. They're generated in a pragmatic, intellectual, quasi-scientific manner from within the elements themselves. The spatial relationship between the component parts is therefore primary, structuring the overall composition in a methodic way. Each of the pictorial elements is functionally equivalent to the others and organized systematically into a unified and logically transparent structure. The artist became fascinated with the attempt to derive the greatest possible variety of forms, employing the most reduced means. He began to systematize and to serialize his pictorial vocabulary accordingly. The elements he used in his paintings, he used solely to realize an abstract world of pure relations, which has a different existence from the world of things. Visual components were reduced to individual units devoid of representational meaning, and compositions were built on the repetition of formal elements, unfolding in dynamic progressions based on particular codification. Color, too, was systematized, consisting of hue, intensity, and saturation. Concrete reality, in other words, was codified into signs rather than presented and considered to be inaccessible without some form of mediation. Morellet also discovered that orders such as the grid not only obliterated centered composition, but also introduced progressions of pictorial density. This culminates in canvases such as this on the screen: purple, blue, green, yellow, orange, red of 1953, 16 circles, blue, yellow, green of 1954, or hexagons with blue and green sides of 1953 as well, in which the identical modular, circular, square, or hexagonal units are repeated across the picture plane, with an interplay of high luminance blues, yellows, or reds, and greens, violets, and oranges of low luminosity. The juxtaposition of colors, creating a powerful dynamism that takes the artist's non-representational art to another register. Likewise, the pictorial elements of interference of three different frames of 1955 and or works like this, yellow, pink, blue, green lines of 1956 are distributed. The pictorial forms, the pictorial elements in works, paintings like these, are distributed across the plane of the canvas in a highly calculated manner. There's no alteration in density between the center and the edges of the rectangular area. By systematically repeating the same units on the painted planes, Morellet at once visually destroyed the surface of the composition and interfered with the integrity of the elements. The latter are serialized in so smooth a gradation that it becomes difficult for the eye to discern a stable pattern. The dynamic tension between the individual elements and the pattern as a whole disturbs, I would argue, any attempt to focus. The paintings inevitably culminate in a kind of optical dazzle, which is real to the eye, but has no material existence. In both morphological and functional terms, paintings such as interference of three different frames and yellow, pink, blue, green lines on white, to which I think we could add 4 double frames of 1958, follow highly developed and articulated structures whose internal logics generate series of unique but related arrangements, kinds of scaffolding whose appearance, though omnipresent, borders on being imperceptible. Very clear scaffolding that is difficult to perceive unless you really study it and analyze it and come to understand it. Anyway, these complex experiments and Morellet's unrelenting interrogation of the possibilities of composition led the artist to mine deeper the logic of systematic variation. He sensed that through systems he could find a different way to handle pictorial elements that would respond better to the concept that he was developing of abstraction. He soon discovered that systems of composition, or better put, perhaps non-composition, such as modular all-over grids, serial progressions, and repeated predetermined patterns, all of which are ways of not composing, of refusing the meanings of parts and divisions. These systems of non-composition allowed for the production of paintings without the back and forth of compositional arrangements. As with concrete art, subjectivity, let alone the intuition of expressiveness of the artist, the intuition or expressiveness of the artist, played no part in the process of production here. Once the code was set, the elements of the painting didn't need to be balanced, adjusted, or even materialized. We kind of have a foreshadowing of Lewitt's program and programs in the 1960s with this model that he's establishing here. Moreover, from the frame of reference of reception, this mode of production entailed a dispersion of subject positions within the aesthetic fields. Grids, serial progressions, and predetermined patterns do not establish a single point of view, but juxtapose an array of intersecting perspectives. They dismantle the totality of the composition into its variable units, releasing them to a performative function of distribution. For Morellet, this culminated in a number of non-compositional, fully abstract pictures that began to take on a dynamism of their own. Artworks such as the Untitled paintings of 1952, 53, and 54, geometric patterns with a virtual dynamism. Do I have more? I do coming up, but geometric patterns with a virtual dynamism. There's a kind of dynamism that begins to pretend to appear. In fact, they're not moving, but there's a dynamism nonetheless. Yet the rational clarity of the compositional process, with the tableau broken down into a calculable ensemble of formal elements comprising a closed quasi-mathematical system, de-emphasizes the subjectivity of the artist and foregrounds instead the analytical dimension of spectatorship. The gradation between intense illusion and literal plane establishes the structural logic of the picture. Although the actual and the illusory are never entirely reconciled, the spectator, nevertheless, can test the possibilities of alternate involvement and detachment. But the repetitive patterns of these canvases also create a reiterative optical kinetic oscillation that would resonate with Morellet's growing interest in dynamism and his attempts to exceed bidimensionality and to lead the eye to a space beyond the frame. Not only are the paintings free of the traditional top-down or horizontal-vertical orientation, but theoretically, the pictorial structure of these works, with its geometrical standard unit or pattern that's repeated over and over again, could be extended in all directions, endlessly, due to the lack of any center of gravity. There are no fixed boundaries and no central position of focus available to the spectator. The concept of composition has ceased to exist in these paintings, as they each now follow an order that can be repeated ad infinitum, where every segment is equal to the whole. The designs are thus just the fragments of an infinite reality. The pictures could be wholly constructed by juggling the simple geometric patterns of rectangles and squares, that is, without really composing at all. The combination of absolute clarity and unity evident in paintings such as 32 Rectangles of 1953 or Blue, Yellow, Red of 1956 are these paintings. What else do I have here? So here's the 32 Rectangles. Blue, Yellow, Red. The combination of absolute clarity and unity that's evident in canvases such as these, compositions or non-compositions such as these, and the remarkable openness of the conceptual order from which those internal relations are derived, its repetition, generates a kind of tension. The compositions are open insofar as the series, as I said a moment ago, can be extended to infinity, and yet closed at the same time insofar as each picture is entirely arranged into an overall grid. Differentiation and de-differentiation are coupled in each work. Morellet's painterly compositions made of structural coordinates prompted him to search for other activities that might satisfy his evolving notion of abstraction. As the 1950s progressed, he began to experiment with elements of chance, which led him directly to the legacy of Marcel Duchamp. But at the very same time, and especially once he met the psychologist François Morellet, with whom he would go on to found, along with a few others, the Centre de Recherche de Visuel in 1960, Morellet became increasingly interested in the operation of the human eye, and in particular in the effects of light on the eye, a process that he considered to be key to the visible. These investigations of the human eye and of the process that takes place when light hits the retina of the eye, these investigations led him to focus on and to explore visual stimuli. The Gestalt theory that he had picked up from Mavigné, de Barros, and ultimately Max Bill, and this is my concluding thesis, by the way, the Gestalt theory that he had picked up from Mavigné, de Barros, and ultimately Max Bill had emphasized the ability of human sensory perception, and especially vision, though vision mediated through a conceptual process, to transform external stimuli into a coherent formal structure or whole. But for Morellet, from this point on, I'm arguing from the moment he meets Molnar, from the late 1950s, let's just say. For Morellet, by the end of the 1950s, the mind's organization of visual data, the smooth and rapid transformation of perception into conception that underpinned a concrete art mediated by Gestalt, had become suspect as ideology's organization of social and material events. And it's interesting that one of the first books that Molnar gives to Morellet is Lukács's History and Class Consciousness, and how the notion of ideology is then folded into the notion of visuality in a very complicated way, which I don't have time to elaborate on here. But therefore, the separation of the physiological reception of a visual object and the conception of that visual object as it's received becomes suspect, because the conception comes to be parallel to the ideological in a complex and so what happens at this point with Morellet's practice is that he comes to understand perception as a direct activity, and that will lead him through the Grave period, I would argue. Comes to understand perception as innate rather than acquired. It's not a concept, it's the human eye as a physiological organ that is receiving things in a positivistic manner, one could almost bluntly say. So innate rather than acquired, and not necessarily linked to conception. The role of the system of vision now was neither to decode inputs nor to construct percepts, but to extract the visual information that registered on the retina. The emphasis was thus solidly on vision, which Morellet now regarded as a wholly unmediated physiological process. The eye was in turn theorized as an extended technology, as a receiving machine. And with this, Morellet's artwork and indeed research would now begin to engage in an entirely new set of problems. Thank you.
Great. Good morning, and thank you, first of all, to everyone for being here, to Dia for inviting me, to Béatrice for also inviting me and engaging me in what I think is one of the more important exhibitions we've seen here in New York in a long time. I am very grateful for Alexander's piece because actually I had some portions of that in my text that I think I'll take out because I actually do pick up the story in 1959-60. And I'm going to speak today, as you see, about François Morellet's involvement as a founder and participant in the Groupe de Recherche d'art visuel, or Groupe, and really looking at that next phase of his career where spectator participation and also interactive installations and new materials enter into his practice. In July 1960, 11 artists from Argentina, France, Hungary, and Spain announced the formation of the Centre de Recherche d'art visuel in a small garage near the Bastille in Marais district of Paris. With their active foundation, Hugo de Marco, Francisco Garcia Miranda, Horacio Garcia Rassi, Julio Leparc, François Molnar, Vera Molnar, Sergio Moyano Cervantes, Francisco Sobrino, Joël Stein, Ivaral, and François Morellet set forth their intention to, quote, unite our plastic activities, efforts, capacities, and individual discoveries in an activity that tends towards that of being a team. They took their cue in part from Victor Vasarely, who had stated in 1960, quote, the star artist or the solitary genius is out of date. Groups of experimental workers collaborating with the aid of scientific and technical disciplines will be the only true creators of the future, unquote. The members of Groupe believed that such a working method would allow them to combat the, quote, traditional image of the uniquely inspired painter and undying masterpieces, a model that was still propagated by the proponents of Tachism and art informel, which the young artists considered to be the latest in a string of sterile, canonized approaches to art. In this regard, they were not alone. By the late 1950s, members of their generation in many countries had begun to devise strategies aimed at overturning the virtual stranglehold of abstract, subjective, and expressive approaches to painting. In the late 50s and 60s in Europe, various artists chose to form groups similar to Groupe. This turn towards group formation and teamwork was quickly recognized as a discernible trend in contemporary art, with biennales and even Documenta 3 and 64 featuring dedicated sections on teamwork, and numerous articles written about the defining characteristics of this tendency. In addition, some of the artist groups banded together with individual artists to form an international consortium, which can also be described as an art movement, known as Nouvelle Tendance, Recherche Continuelle. Groupe played an important part in this history of the short-lived supergroup, which I'll address today. So today I'm very pleased to be able to think about this aspect of Morellet's career, and in the paper I'm going to explore the history of artist groups in Europe in the 1960s through his eyes in part, with a focus in particular on these 8 years of Groupe's activities. So my first part had actually addressed the trip to Brazil, so I'm going to just sort of paraphrase instead of read, because I think what was the most important part of what Alexander addressed was this connection point to Almir Mavigné, who is a figure that is perhaps underappreciated as of now in terms of his connection points with artists in Europe in this generation. Mavigné, as we'll see today, was someone who helped Morellet and his colleagues to gain exhibitions in various locations. And so actually, I'm going to jump ahead that, in fact, through, Courtney kindly mentioned the Zero show that I curated. The Zero artists actually were a point of connection for Mavigné to Piero Manzoni, who, as many of you in the room probably know, in 1959 with Enrico Castellani founded the Galleria Azimut in Milan. It lasted for 2 years and generated some very important, two very important issues of a journal. In January 1960, Manzoni contacted Morellet on Mavigné's recommendation about participating in one of the early exhibitions in the gallery. The show ran from April 15th to May 2nd, 1960. Here you're seeing 2 installation views and the invitation card. They decided to use the title motus, which is derived from an expression meaning to keep mum about something. The invitation card included a text by Morellet's friend and fellow Grave member, and soon thereafter, Joël Stain, and it reads, quote, "Motus is the common denominator of painters who put painting before the signature. Motus is against personality." And so it's really from this point onwards, you've heard this active foundation of Grave that becomes Grave, but this idea that, which was very important to François Morellet in particular, he really wanted his group to get away with signatures, to do away with signatures. But it's sort of interesting that, in fact, reconstructing the show, a lot of scholars have had challenges because the works were not shown under individual signatures and names. However, it was important for Morellet, I should note, because he did sell one of the paintings from the show to Lucio Fontana. So I think art historically, one must not leave that piece behind. So let's see. So some months after this is the active foundation of the Grave. Some months after the show in Milan, the members of Grave held their first presentation in their rented garage space. By then, the group's number had been reduced to 7, following the resignations of DeMarco, the Molnars, and Cervantes. With the exception of Garcia Miranda, who left the group in November '61, this presentation included the final 6 members of Grave, the titular 6 heads of my talk today. In keeping with the promise of the active foundation to produce theoretical as well as plastic work, the group posted a jointly, here's the group in the studio, or atelier. In keeping with the promise, the group posted a jointly written text on the wall that was called An Appraisal of Our Research. They began by stating, quote, "We think there is a need to make it clear that our attitude excludes all claims to the absolute and definitive." They rejected the word art and all it stood for, but acknowledged that they could not achieve their goals of transforming art into a more integral part of human activity without engaging with the existing art system. With a view to achieving their goal of demystifying art, they committed to focusing on research into visual phenomena and emphasizing homogeneity and anonymity as opposed to emotionalism. By 1961, the members of the Grave had changed the group's name to Grave, and around the same time, go there, some of the group's members were invited to participate in the landmark 1961 exhibition of Befogen Beweging, which was presented at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, Moderne Museet Stockholm, and Louisa Museum in Humlebach, Denmark. The curator, Carl Pontus Hulten, had told Grave that the materials that they had sent for the catalog had arrived too late and there was no more budget for the catalog, something I guess we all still find often happening, and nevertheless, and so with the financial assistance of Gallery Denise René, who had, through the influence of Vasarely, had really become, and the various connections to her gallery had become involved in their history at an early point, paid to publish the brochure you see on the screen, Proposals on Movement, which was really their first public statement about, under the new name, and actually then it was repurposed in 1962 on the occasion of their exhibition at the Maison des Beaux-Arts, and there was a catalog that had a few texts that I'm going to refer to here, but just to give you the context. For that, the title of the exhibition in that gallery was Instability, or L'instabilité, and it actually included, as you see on the screen, not just paintings, which of course was the focus of that earlier work that was in the Motu show and the work that Alexander was showing, but here you begin to see new materials like Julio Leparc's use of plexi squares in the work on the right of the installation view. And what basically emerges is that there are 3 themes that already surface in the work, which is light, movement, and instability. These become the vocabularies already at this early moment in the early 60s. During this show, I'm going to go to there, the group solicited feedback from visitors via a questionnaire, which could be filled out and deposited in that box you see on the screen in the gallery. The 2,000 respondents indicated they were especially attracted to the group's use of light and movement and appreciated that they incorporated instability. So I don't know who filled those out, but they really helped them out. Instability would serve as the title of almost without exception, almost all the subsequent exhibitions of Grove for many years. And it really did capture the artist's intention to move beyond static artworks and the idea of challenging passive viewing. The catalog, here's Mavigné again, he's coming back in. The catalog for instability also included a text, Nouvelle Tendance, in which Grove wrote about a network of like-minded artists and artist groups that had come into focus following the August 1961 exhibition Nova Tendencija at the Gallery of Contemporary Art in Zagreb, Yugoslavia, now Croatia. Mavigné had co-organized the show with art critic Matko Meštrović and Božo Beck, the director of the gallery. It included Morellet, Leparc, and Stein, and artists affiliated with some of the other groups that had already formed at that moment, including Zero, that had formed in Düsseldorf in 1957, and Groupe N that had been founded in Padova in 1959. The Zagreb exhibition inspired Grove to commence an extensive letter-writing campaign to artists and artist groups, as well as to Jean Cassu, the director of the Musée National d'Art Moderne in Paris, with the goal of organizing projects under a singular banner of Nouvelle Tendance. The original Yugoslavian, Serbo-Croatian title was a plural, New Tendencies, and this is a phrase that kept getting used a lot of different ways at the time. The 1962 text represents a preliminary attempt to define Nouvelle Tendance, although Grove admitted that its nature was not yet definitive. They noted that the work of many of the artists still exhibited traits of concrete art, constructivism, Taschism, and neo-Dada. That's where Manzoni came in, actually. And the group found these nuances actually quite incompatible with what they wanted Nouvelle Tendance to represent. While the majority of the text elaborated on what Nouvelle Tendance was against, it also made a preliminary attempt to define what the artists were for. Grove stated that the artists associated with this phenomenon shared a commitment to continuous research. It's a lexicon that keeps getting repeated throughout all these texts of theirs and Nouvelle Tendance. Completely separate, quote, completely separate from the artistic phenomenon and producing non-definitive works of art. So no longer the static, definitive painting on the wall with a system, but things that might change in response to the viewer. It can be said that they shared a leftist political orientation. You were starting to get at that, with some of them embracing kind of very classic socialist views and others veering more towards strong Marxist and communist affiliations, particularly those from Eastern Europe. The essay also included a list of Nouvelle Tendance artists, with one subsequently circulated in October 1962 letter that Grove sent to its colleagues. That list emphasized the dominant presence of artist groups, and there, in addition to the groups I mentioned previously, there was Equipo 57 that was founded in Cordoba in 1957, Gruppo T founded in Milan, Nul in Amsterdam in 1961. So there was already, like late 50s going into the 60s, an incredible proliferation of these groups, and Grove was drawing them in their writings to the Nouvelle Tendance movement. When Grove became frustrated by the lack of response to the October letter, the group convened a meeting in their Marais studio, which you see the photo there on the right, in early November 62. That meeting and its subsequent discussions resulted in the adoption of a new name, a kind of articulated version of the name of what they called an international movement, which became Nouvelle Tendance Recherche Continuelle. So continuous research gets pulled into the title. It's no longer just a new tendency. And this prepared the discussion for the ground for discussions in 1963 about the structure and rules of this international movement, which Grove figured heavily in, although Julio Leparc was the primary driver in that instance. So I'm not going to go deep into that today, just to say that over the course of 62 to 63, this idea that a movement is sort of like a supergroup starts to be discussed and debated, particularly with tensions between the French and the Italians. Grove and many of the other artists viewed their non-definitive works and formal explorations of instability as a conceptual mirror of the instability of reality itself, and they expressed the desire to impact society through their practice. In late September 1963, the subject of artist groups and their role in linking art with broader social objectives dominated discussions at the 22nd International Convention of Artists, Critics, and Art Students held in Verrocchio, Italy. Julio Leparc delivered a paper on behalf of the Grove, Proposal for a Space of Activation, in which he stated, quote, "People today are subject to a social organization based on the predominance of dependence, and the viewer of visual art is caught up in this situation." He contended that any efforts to undermine the passivity of art viewing had the potential to highlight and ameliorate the problems that characterize society at large by encouraging spectators to assume agency. Leparc introduced a strategy for engendering what he referred to as a climate of communication and interaction, namely the creation of a hypothetical place, quote, that may have the character and appearance of an experimental art gallery, a stage, a television set, a conference room, a studio, a school, and so on. But it will have none of these specific features. In the same month that Julio Leparc delivered the paper on behalf of Grave, Grave itself presented its first truly collective work at the Third Biennale de Paris, which was featured in a new section dedicated to teamwork. Raymond Cognier, a member of the organizing council for the Biennale, described the teams as, quote, an avant-garde in the extreme, that were engaging the future in extremely original ways through this collaboration between different artistic disciplines. For this presentation, Grave again used the term l'instabilité as the title, however, adding a subtitle of the labyrinth. And here I actually just wanted to pause to show you, these are some great images of the members of Grave working on their installation together. Obviously, the very canonical, iconic sphere of Morellet himself that Beatrice has included in the exhibition, but just to really see that's evident. But they were really working together to conceive this labyrinth, and this is actually the catalog with a map with very kind of intense descriptions of each part of this labyrinth. The term reflected, obviously, the spatial aspect of the work, comprised of a series of 7 connected spaces that were meant to evoke the maze-like structure of a labyrinth. In them, the artist presented the viewer with what they referred to as 20 situations that were to be experienced through the series of non-traditional objects, including, let's see if I've got the picture here, yeah, one by Morellet incorporating light fixtures. They invited spectators to touch the works and participate by interacting and playing with objects that eluded traditional aesthetic categories. In response to an article by the architect of the Paris Biennale, when he used all this sort of very almost informal language of this new movement being this no great emotional achievement, Grave decided to issue their second manifesto, having previously done so during the first Paris Biennale, entitled Enough Mystification. They took issue with how art experts attempt to mediate spectators' viewing experiences. In this, I think I feel a little guilty. Sometimes I'm part of that. And beckoned viewers to heed a rebellious and anarchic call that they used as the conclusion of the manifesto. It is forbidden not to participate. It is forbidden not to touch. It is forbidden not to break. In 1964 and 65, Grave continued to explore the environmental interactive format of the labyrinth, which reinforced their collective practice and emphasis on spectator participation, which really became the core lexicon, if you will, of their work at that time, as well as a playful and experiential nature of the work itself. They presented labyrinths in 1964, and this is a drawing for an exhibition in 1964 of the Nouvelle Tendance in the Musée des Arts Décoratifs. And it's interesting because I had mentioned in 1962 they had written to Jean Cassou trying to advocate for a show in Paris, and there had been 2 years that had to pass where the group movements became very popular and they gained all this recognition, and suddenly it was possible to have a museum exhibition of Nouvelle Tendance. And this show came really on the heels of a heated war, I would argue, between Enzo Mari and Julio Leparc and others around what the direction of Nouvelle Tendance should be, because they had in fact excommunicated the members of Zero. And so the fact this show happened was an absolute miracle. But in any case, it was the second occasion where the labyrinth was shown. And many of the artists at that point had moved into this environmental mode, into really trying to have the viewer have the opportunity to complete the work of art, either how they physically reacted to the work or whether they had touch involved. 1965, they continued in this direction, having their second exhibition, in fact, at a gallery called The Contemporaries here in New York. And here they reproduced the Enough Mystifications manifesto in English, only they transformed the title into Stop Art, and which is great. And this show is extremely important because it actually coincides with the responsive eye, which I think is something we might want to dig into later this afternoon, because Morellet, Leparc, and we're both in Responsive Eye, but Responsive Eye is this moment where the curator, William Zeitz, had been collaborating or speaking a lot with Denise Renee about who to include, and the critical reception just decimated the Europeans. It was, in many, I have argued elsewhere that it actually was part of America's attempt to kick them out of art history, but that's something I think we could dig into a bit later. And then finally in 1965, they go back to the Biennale de Paris and they have another one of these labyrinths. And I think that what's important to note is they were using the term game rooms as well, because that notion of play, not just that you were looking at something, but you were playing and enjoying, and you were thinking, you were somehow, your activities were going to inform your overall mindset, was really fundamental to what they were doing in that sort of 63 to 65 period. Groupe had repeatedly claimed that it wanted to replace the term art and challenge a system that valorized the artist as a producer whose output reflected the individual's personality and vision. Their sincerity was called into question in 1966 when Julio Leparc represented Argentina at the Venice Biennale and won the grand prize for painting. Which is funny, I'm showing you these works because clearly that's not a painting. Anyway, while many hailed his prize as a victory for artists working in new mediums, others found it difficult to understand how Leparc could accept such an official award, let alone participate in such an event in light of his and the group's anti-art world polemic. Morellet jumped into the debate with a text in the catalog for the Argentinian pavilion. Known for his use of humor, Morellet mimicked the voices of Groupe's critics. Quote, "The bastards, they kick up a fuss about the system, see all these biennials as mystification, but you just try getting them to refuse the most traditional of prizes, the most rotten art world wheeling and dealing." Morellet went on to acknowledge that, quote, "As far as being seen, there is no solution. The whole system of the visual arts is founded on the galleries exhibiting and selling art. Museums, reviews, cultural centers, architects, and film producers only allow people to produce experiments if they produce something, as long as they are seen as producers and not researchers, or something else if you want less pretension, we are doomed to contradiction," unquote. Just a few months prior to the Biennale, Groupe had realized a joint project aimed at circumventing the art system. As early as 1964, after Groupe's first two labyrinths had been realized, the group began discussing the next step in their plan to create a new situation that would get non-specialist, non-elitist audiences to interact with objects as well as with other people. There was this element, too, that part of the participation was, if we were standing in the same room, we might start talking about what was happening. So the group decided to take their work into the streets of Paris, and I think I'm just going to skip past that so you can see it, with Morellet on the bottom left. So the group decided to take their art into the streets of Paris to confront spectators outside the confines of museums and galleries, so that the viewers were not arriving armed with expectations and preconceived notions. They ultimately realized this project, A Day in the Street, Une Journée dans la Rue, between 8 a.m. and midnight on Tuesday, April 19, 1966. As you're seeing in the images, the members of Groupe set up a series of objects at sites, actually I'm going to go now to the map that was in the brochure, at sites centered around major stops on the Paris metro, such as Châtelet, and heavily trafficked areas including Montparnasse, the Champs-Élysées, and Jardin des Tuileries, and the Latin Quarter. The map for the Day on the Street was part of a pamphlet containing a brief history of the group, an explanation of the project, a questionnaire, they go back to the questionnaire, and caricature-like renderings of the objects to be shown in each location. As stated in the pamphlet's text, despite their high hopes for the event, the group remained conscious of the limitations of their interventions. Quote, "We do not think that our attempt will be enough to shatter a routine weekday in Paris. It may be considered as merely a simple displacement in the situation. But in spite of its very limited scope, it will help us enter into contact with a public that has not been forewarned. We view this as an attempt to go beyond the traditional rapport between work of art and public." So I think that it's very important. It's interesting talking to the different members when I was working on my dissertation, and they talked about how they had to run around to get away from the police because they didn't understand what was going on. And so already there was a lot of confusion going on, but nevertheless, you can see people actually did step on the blocks. They did take the questionnaire and so on. So there was that sense of fun was also present. Okay, so In 1968, what turned out to be the final year of Grove's collective activities, the group was invited to mount their first major museum retrospective in Europe at the Museum an Ostwall in Dortmund, Germany, from February 11th to March 31st. Sizable exhibition contained over 100 works. And you see all of the artists out front of the museum, and then inside with this great kind of the children. There's always these great images of the children interacting with and playing with these works. And now those children have grown up, and some of them, I think, are probably working on these histories, I have a feeling. So about a month after the Dortmund show in April 1968, and here I'm just going to actually go back to this, Grove issued a new mission statement that they entitled New Commitment, which reviewed the group's efforts to date to change the artist-work-spectator, artist-public relationship. It explained that the members had sought to transform the social structures that affected and defined these relationships by developing the new categories of objects known as labyrinths, playrooms, and experiments. In this text, the group also described an aspirational project that combined many of the elements of their previous collective efforts. The artists wanted to take their work and writings to an audience in other regions in France. Julio Leparc provided some details of the plan in a June 67 interview, and I just want to have you focus on that little truck at the top. Quote, among our projects, there is the following: to fit out an old Parisian transports bus and go on tour around France. In it, we would put fold-away placards that we would set up inside and all around. If we had just one vehicle like the ones used by huge circuses, and if we stopped in a different town every day, or if we even linked up with a tour by a famous singer, we would make contact with a totally different audience, unquote. Less than 1 month after that text was published, the historic events of May 1968 unfolded, with students taking to the streets and workers waging widespread strikes. The active protests of these newly empowered groups brought about the sort of social mobilization that Grove had been advocating for nearly 8 years. As Morellet himself noted, the group was pleased to see the possibility of real social change, although its members were disappointed to realize, quote, the people had awoken without us. In June, Julio Leparc was arrested for his participation in a rally at the Renault factory in the Seine Valley and subsequently expelled from France. Soon after his return, the group, which had already grown apart, and really throughout the history of the group, Morellet, Leparc, and Stein were the real activators, and in fact, the real theorists of the movement and the group. They agreed that they were going to end their collaboration. On November 15, 1968, the 6 members signed and issued the Act or Article of Dissolution. Writing in a month later in December, Morellet expressed in his retrospective frustration that the group had not adopted his suggestion at the outset to stop using individual signatures. Quote, the more anonymous a group's members, the more coherent the group. The proposition I made 8 years ago to once and for all get rid of all individual signatures for the group members was turned down. So it was inevitable that the group would disappear as soon as people started to enjoy individual success. The dissolution of Grove marked not only an ending for the Paris-based group, but also the collapse of the group phenomenon that had emerged in Europe in the late 50s and 60s. Although that chapter in art history ended nearly 50 years ago, the artists' shared goals of working with others and activating the spectator with a view to affecting change in society have remained relevant, and their legacy can still be felt today. Thank you.
Thank you to Dia, and thank you all for coming. This talk, as you see, is going to be called 99 Preparatory Notes to the Work of François Morellet. Number 1. This is a detail from 40,000 Squares, an installation François Morellet conceived in 1960 and created in 1963. Its full title is Aleatory Distribution of 40,000 Squares according to the even and odd numbers in a telephone directory, 50% blue, 50% red. Number 2. Much like the global ratio of males to females, the 1-to-1 ratio of blue squares to red squares is an approximation. 3. Pi is an irrational number. 4. Mes commentaires is the title of an essay Morellet wrote in 1999, and which would eventually become the name of his book of collected writings about art, mostly his art. A utilitarian English translation of the title would be, But How to Silence My Commentaries. 5. That this is the title of a book of commentary should suffice to give everyone here a sense of the kind of guy we're dealing with. 6. The form of 99 preparatory notes was created by the Oulipian Frédéric Forte. 7. I cannot say with certainty that chance exists. 8. Morellet in 1991. My position for 40 years has been to oppose myself to the conventional practice of painters and sculptors whose every work is composed by thousands of subjective decisions and manual imprecisions. 9. There can be no commentary without subjectivity, but the two are not the same thing. 10. Grave was founded in 1960 by François Morellet along with a handful of other artists. The name stands for Groupe de Recherche d'Art Visuel, or Group for Visual Art Research. 11. The Oulipo was founded in 1960 by François Lullianet and Raymond Queneau, along with a handful of other writers and scientists. The name stands for Ouvroir de Littérature Potentielle, or Workshop for Potential Literature. 12. For a time, Morellet ran a family-owned toy factory. 13. Morellet saw the logical consequence of his opposition to subjectivity and imprecision in art as the removal of himself, as much as humanly possible, from his art. 14. The Oulipo was founded not so much in opposition to subjectivity and imprecision as out of skepticism with regard to the sustainability and, quite frankly, the legitimacy of literature as inspired by the ineffable touch of the muse. 15. The 33rd digit of pi is 0. This is the first time 0 appears in the sequence. 16. Morellet in 1993. Choosing is painful, be it a dish for a meal, a woman for life, or a work for an exhibition. 17. For a time early in his career, Morellet only painted on square canvases, thereby eliminating one choice he might otherwise have had to make. 18. This is an example of an Oulipian form called the Prisoners Constraint, in which all letters with ascenders or descenders are prohibited, and only lowercase letters with the height of an X can be used. The name comes from the idea of a prisoner locked in a cell with an extremely limited supply of paper on which to write his or her memoirs. 19. The Oulipo's only official definition of itself is rats who build the labyrinth from which they plan to escape. 20. To make 40,000 squares, Morellet drew 200 vertical lines and crossed them with 200 horizontal lines. In each of the resulting 5 square millimeter boxes, he wrote a single digit based on the successive numbers in a telephone directory. If the last digit in the phone number was even, he drew an X in the box. If the last digit was odd, he left the box blank. Then he painted the boxes with crosses blue and the boxes without crosses red. 21. Morellet once said that he had chosen painting because it seemed to him the medium best suited to not saying anything. 22. He said this in an essay. 23. John Cage. I have nothing to say, I am saying it, and that is poetry. 24. Morellet used the number pi as a generative element throughout his career, from 6 aleatory distributions of 4 black and white squares according to the even and odd digits of the number pi in 1958, to pi weeping neonly in the early aughts. 25. Every time I see the title Pi Weeping Neonly, there is a moment before my brain parses it when I think it is the name of a Chinese weekly newspaper. 26. Oulipians have used the number 99 as a generative element since Queneau's Exercises in Style, in which the same literarily uninteresting anecdote about a dispute on a Parisian bus is recounted in 99 different forms and registers. 27. Oulipians have also used pi as generative element, most notably in a series of irrational sonnets by Jacques Bass, in which the ordinary distribution of lines per stanza in the French sonnet 4-4-3-3 is replaced by 3-1-4-1-5. 28. Morellet often wrote about the way different spectators brought different associations and appreciations to a work of art. He referred to this as unpacking one's picnic. 29. The form of 99 preparatory notes is meant to exhaust the potentiality of a given subject by what Forte describes as polyphonic play. Number 30. This is an image of a heterogram by the Oulipian Georges Perec, in which each line is an anagram of all other lines, which is to say each line uses the 11 most commonly used letters in the French alphabet once and only once. When spacing and punctuation are read into the sequence, a poem emerges. 31. In the late 70s, Morellet identified 5 primary chapters in his work to date: juxtaposition, fragmentation, interference, superposition, and chance. 32. Is it the product of chance that superposition, in addition to its spatial sense, also refers to the state in which Schrödinger's cat both is and is not alive? 33. Is it the product of chance that today is 3-3? 34. One of the central characters in Perec's Life a User's Manual, a novel containing 99 chapters, is Percival Bartlebooth, a wealthy Englishman who spends 10 years learning to paint and then 20 years traveling the world and painting one watercolor seascape every 2 weeks, creating a total of 500 paintings from 500 different harbors. Once each painting is completed, it is sent back to Paris, where it is mounted onto a board and cut into an original jigsaw puzzle. After returning from his travels, Bartlebooth spends the rest of his life assembling the jigsaw puzzles in the order of their creation, and after completing each one, he has a craftsman fill in the seams, remove the backing, and mail the original painting back to the harbor where it was painted, where, exactly 20 years after it was first painted, it is dipped in a detergent solution and restored to its original state, a sheet of blank watercolor paper. 35. This is a detail from a chemogram by the Belgian artist Pierre Cordier, whose work Morellet once praised as an exemplary place for a picnic, based on the structure of Life a User's Manual, which uses an algorithm mimicking the way the knight moves around a chessboard. 36. Mes commentaires is a clever title because it repeats a set of phonemes that mean different things the first and second time. This is also why it is difficult to translate. 37. Morellet's career could be divided, instructively, though not comprehensively so, between the period where his titles were utilitarian and the period where his titles were puns. 38. Neither Oulipo nor Grave, neither potential literature nor visual art research, is specific enough to be particularly informative to anyone not already aware of what either group actually does. 39. Grave was originally called Crave. Morellet was responsible for changing the C, for center, into a G, for group. 40. Perfect circles do not exist in nature. 41. An impressionistic translation of mes commentaires, silencing silent things. 42. Morellet sometimes referred to his methods as applying systematic chance, which he admitted certain purists would regard as an oxymoron. 43. While he was writing even and odd digits in the 40,005 square millimeter boxes, he had his wife and children read the phone book out loud to him. 44. The removal of the self is not humanly possible. 45. The desire to use a smaller system to escape the gravitational pull of a larger one is, if not fundamental to the Oulipo's reason for being, often appealed to as a way to interpret its work. In an interview, the Oulipian Jacques Roubaud once quoted one of the group's founding members as saying that the world exerts innumerable constraints on us, the worst being that the only way out of the labyrinth is death. The most we can do, Roubaud said, the founding member said, is to cordon off a small part of the labyrinth where we choose which constraints to obey. 46. The Oulipo's labyrinths are textual or narrative, while Grave's were spatial. Both are interactive, but in different ways. 47. Grave is in most respects a better acronym than Oulipo. 48. Morellet, like Perec, expressed a feeling of great vertigo when faced with the idea of pure, genuine freedom. 49. Morellet in 1980. There is a great danger of being misunderstood when you say nothing. 50. A joke. A physicist, an engineer, and a mathematician are all challenged to build the shortest possible fence around a herd of resting cattle. The physicist takes out a piece of graph paper and plots the position of each cow, giving each a pair of XY coordinates, then determines the lines connecting all the points. Finally, he constructs a fence based on his diagram. I'm done, he says. Since the interior region bounded by line segments connecting the cattle points is convex, it follows that the boundary is minimal, QED. The engineer secures a strong fence pole near the cattle, then attaches one end of a 6-foot-high roll of wire fence to the pole and walks around the cows, slowly letting out the roll of wire until he comes back to the post. He gives the roll to the physicist and tells him to start pulling. As the physicist pulls, the engineer runs around the outside of the fence, kicking the cows, flailing his arms and screaming at them, all the while yelling, "Pull the fence tighter!" Finally, the cows are shoved so close together that they can't move, and the fence is wrapped around them so tightly that it leaves marks on their hides. The engineer nails the other end of the fence to the post, cuts away the roll, and says, "There, that is the shortest fence." The mathematician walks over to the roll of wire fence, cuts off a small piece, wraps it around himself, and declares, "I'm on the outside." 51. The other zeros in the first 100 digits are pi, are numbers 51, 55, 66, 72, 77, 86, and 98. 52. The form of 99 preparatory notes, says Forte, is not exactly constrained, but has a great deal to do with potentiality. 53. Morellet once described his body of work as a whole program of systems as rigorous as they are absurd. 54. In the mid-1990s, the Olympian Jacques Jouet invented a form called the poème de métro, or subway poem, in which you compose the first verse of a poem in your head while the train is in motion, write it down when the train makes its first stop, compose the second verse when the train starts again, and so on until you have written a poem whose number of verses is equal to the number of stations you have passed through minus 1. No writing is allowed while the train is in motion. No composing while it is stationary. 55. In 1996, Jouet wrote an exhaustive subway poem using a route optimized for him by the Olympian graph theorist Pierre Rosenstiel that passed through each station in the Parisian metro system at least once. It took 15.5 hours. 56. Some months later, he did it again, backwards. 57. Toward the end of his life, Morellet took to writing palindromes about art. They were mostly not very good, but most intentional palindromes aren't. 58. The idea of art as a picnic is both fundamentally true and a crafty way of shirking responsibility. 59. Is commentary all that is extraneous to art, or is all art commentary? 60. Morellet in 1987. For me, anyway, the greatest works of art are the result of a combat between an artist and one or several constraints. 61. The Oulipo as a collective has complicated feelings about the relevance of the word constraint to its methods, but it has historically been opposed to chance. 62. Mes commentaires is an example of what Oulipians call a beau présent, or beautiful in-law, which means it contains no letters not present in the name François Morellet. 63. Morellet's first appearance in the Oulipo's archives is a photocopy from the meeting on January 19, 2001, of a page of palindromes from Mes commentaires. His name is spelled wrong in the minutes. 64. I could have sworn that Mes commentaires did not come out until 2 years later. 65. These 99 preparatory notes have only the appearance of aleatory distribution. 66. Pi is an attempt to map a system onto our understanding of the universe. Is that rational or irrational? 67. Raymond Queneau once praised Raymond Roussel as uniting the madness of the mathematician with the rationality of the poet. 68. Raymond Queneau, as far as I've been able to tell, invented the choose-your-own-adventure story. 69. The 99th digit of pi is 6. 70. Another impressionistic translation. Calm and airy commentary. 71. The attribution of telephone numbers to people in the chronological order of their registering telephone lines, and then the compilation of those numbers in a book constrained by geographic region and alphabetized by last names they were given some number of decades ago, based on an arbitrary patriarchal system of nomenclature, is not so much chance as a high-level confluence of systems working in unwitting concert. But it's not hard to see why systematic chance is appealing shorthand. 72. Does arbitrary mean more subject to the interference of chance or less? 73. I translate poème de métro as subway poem or metro poem, depending on what city I'm in. 74. If art is a picnic, then chance is the ants. A satisfying rhyme, but ultimately a vacuous proposition. 75. By the end of his career, Morellet's use of wordplay had come to seem almost involuntary. 76. Is the infinite sequence of digits that makes up pi the product of chance? 77. The adjective Oulipian was used in Le Monde for the first time on March 5, 2011, in the headline of an article about a Morellet exposition at the Centre Pompidou in Paris. 78. A translation that approaches the operative sense while still mostly missing the point. How to say silence. 79. What is more absurd than silence? 80. Morellet in 2005. Now I am sure of it, I do not like making decisions. And in any case, it seems to me that contrary to the heroes of novels, I have never had any important decisions to make. 81. Choosing not to choose is a choice. 82. Saying something about not saying anything is still saying something. 83. I don't know which founding member of the Oulipo made the comment about death in the labyrinth. 84. That mes commentaires is a beau présent was almost certainly not intentional on Morellet's part, and had I pointed it out to him, I assume he would have cordoned it off as belonging to my picnic and mine alone. Nonetheless, I suspect he would have been pleased by its efficiency, its wastelessness, its zero-sum quality. 85. The worst translation. Hushing a lush shingle. 86. Not even applied atavism, which is to say creating a system to make creative decisions, cancels out the human consequences of authorship. 87. This is a roundabout way of answering a question I am often asked about the Oulipo's apparent lack of interest in computer-generated literature. 88. When you run a factory, you cannot dissociate yourself from what is made there, even if you don't personally work on the assembly line, even if you spend all day every day in an office overlooking the assembly line playing solitaire. 89. And who wants to hear that the artist wasn't even paying attention when the work was produced? That's not art, that's spam. 90. Or is it nature? 91. I wonder how many picnics held around the world over the course of Morellet's lifetime involved a dish prepared with spam. 92. No matter how anonymous the artist would like to be, how invisible, how silent, he still chooses the park where the picnic is held. 93. The simultaneous and mutually exclusive desires to leave no trace on the world and to mark it permanently. 94. The neighbor Bartlebooth employs to turn his completed puzzles back into watercolors is named Morellet. 95. What is more absurd than art? 96. This is an image of Morellet standing inside 40,000 squares. 97. Morellet in 1998. At the end of my existence, I must admit that life, the universe, Basque berets, among others, have no meaning. On the other hand, as of recently, I can affirm with joy that the decimals of the number pi have a meaning, perhaps even several. 98. And that is poetry. 99. I cannot say with certainty that chance does not exist. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hi. Thank you so much for joining, for returning, for sticking up with us. I wanted just to add a few thank yous. This exhibition really and the entire project wouldn't exist without Jessica Morgan, director here at Dia. She's had the vision, she's been familiar with François' work, and I was very lucky that she called me. Thank you so much. This event and many other things, including the book, will be, I'm sure, a wonderful thing thanks to the guidance of Courtney Martin and Stephen Hoban. Thank you for helping out and being such wonderful collaborators. Hard challenge for me now after the demonstrations of expertise and humor this morning. I'm really going to try to do my best. I'll be talking about how Morellet puts his geometry in motion, both literally and metaphorically, and how he seemed to be adopting what he called, and this is an oxymoron obviously, a versatile style. For the first 20 years of his career, his artistic career, Morellet, and I'm really quoting his own words, was a Sunday painter. And Florent, are you saying that you are in this picture? This is on the left, for instance, a promotional picture for toys, toy cars and baby strollers. And to the right, another interesting little illustration put together by the Morellet-Guérino factory. Morellet was a Sunday painter for the first 20 so years of his career because starting in 1952, his mature production, and he was a self-taught artist. In other words, he never went to art school or art history. Between 1952 and 1975, the year his family, the Morellet-Guérinot, sold their business, again, toy car, baby strollers, Morellet could only work on his art in his spare time. That is, in the evening and over the weekend, often with the help of his wife, Danielle, and his sons, or eldest son, Frédéric, and perhaps Florent as well. His weekdays were spent at the Morellet-Guérinot offices, which were located in Cholet, the artist's hometown, a small industrial city in Maine-et-Loire. François Morellet often joked that Cholet was on the way to nowhere, except perhaps New York. And although he was a keen traveler with his wife Danielle and his family, and while he even was tempted for a moment to expatriate himself and his family, as we've heard this morning brilliantly, to Brazil, while Morellet remained in Cholet his entire life. Besides sporadic moments of intense exchanges with other artists, Morellet was actually, for that reason, relatively isolated up until the early 1960s. Yet it didn't prevent him from creating a substantial body of work offering an innovative approach to geometric abstraction, partially through his activities within the group he helped found, Groupe. He spent more time in the 60s in Paris, but also abroad, traveling as he was invited to contribute to important exhibitions. The Responsive Eye at MoMA, which was also mentioned this morning, and I believe we'll talk about it later on this afternoon, in 1965. And this is the work that was exhibited there. It was 140 by 140 centimeters. We are showing an 80 by 80 version in our exhibition here at Dia. During the 60s, Morellet, as an individual or member of the group, was also invited to contribute to the Documentas in Kassel, both in 64 and 68, or even at the Venice Biennale in 1970. But it's not until the early 1970s that Morellet knew a real breakthrough. And that breakthrough was his first museum survey exhibition, solo exhibition. By then, he was already a prolific artist with a wide-ranging practice using diverse mediums and materials. But he decided, because it was his first foray in institutional exposure, to focus really on the core of his practice, that is painting, to which he had fully returned after an almost complete hiatus during the Grave years. He had almost given up on painting at the time. And at that opportunity that was very new to him to show in museums, well, Morellet didn't hesitate to feature his paintings en masse. You can notice in that lower image here, and I'm so glad I'm using this laser pointer. People will know. See how the hanging, for instance, is so dense, using double rows of canvases and panels. And this was the inaugural iteration of what actually became a really long traveling show. And he went to numerous venues in Europe. But it did start and was initiated by the Van App Museum in Eindhoven in the Netherlands. But something maybe a little more peculiar appears when one starts to look at installation views of the other venues of that show. Compact groupings of works, I mean, fine, it's a hanging style. But then something more instrumental is happening when one notices, for instance, that, and this is true for several works in that show, but let's take that one example. From Yellow to Purple, executed in 1956. Looking at images from, let's say, 2 consecutive German venues the same year, 1971, it turns out that the work was displayed in Hamburg, for instance, horizontally with the red part on the left, which is what you can see here on the slide. And this was the orientation in accordance with Morellet's prep drawing of the same year, which seems to have constituted at the time the original correct orientation. Well, that is, if there is a correct orientation, because just a few months later, in Frankfurt, Du Jaune au Violet was hung vertically. Furthermore, since its acquisition in 1981 by the Centre Pompidou in Paris, Du Jaune au Violet was hung not only in the two different orientations I just mentioned, but yet in a third one, horizontally, but this time with the blue part on the left side, which is now the currently accepted orientation of the work. And this is exactly how we hung it here at Dia in the galleries. As the artist humorously clarified in a letter to Germain Viat, the director of the Pompidou Center in the early 1980s, many of Morellet's systems were, and Daniel mentioned this earlier this morning, they were like béret basque. Il n'y a pas de sens. In other words, many of his systems, they're like berets. There's no right sides to put them, to wear them, or to hang them. Well, here was playing on words again, because with the word sens in French, he meant both side, physical side, but also meaning. There's no meaning to them. His systems offer no other meaning beyond the self-described content, which you can find indeed in their self-explanatory titles very often. And because, at least according to Morellet, his systems were fully autonomous and self-sufficient, which he referred to, Alex, this morning. They don't refer to anything outside, or there's no semiotic transformation of outside references. While although physical orientation of the work on the wall is a central convention in art history, well, logically, Morellet concluded that it had here little importance. Sourcing an interesting anecdote from Serge Lemoine's reference book from 1986, published by Vasa in Zurich, Yvan Amboise notes, and I quote, "While From Yellow to Violet might have represented a breaking point for Morellet, as he, for the first time, vigorously asserted the system he employed, the artist, in fact, did not like the painting and confessed that he only showed it, and years after its completion at that, because France persuaded him that it had to be seen, if anything, because of a certain American star." Well, of course, this star we know is Frank Stella. And it's true that it's hard to ignore that the striking resemblance between Morellet's 1956 painting and Stella's 1962 series, so a good 5-6 years later, based on concentric squares. And this is here maybe the most famous example, Jasper's Dilemma. Well, on the side note, and you would think it's almost like a conspiracy theory, this example of extreme lookalike is only just one case among other cases of what Yvan Amboise called, and wonderfully analyzed, pseudomorphosis, pertaining to Françoise Morellet's pioneering production. It would seem that many of Françoise's work foreshadowed not only other works by Stella, but also works by other artists, most notably Sol LeWitt. I will leave this debate to the side for today, but for the ones here who would love to learn more, please go ahead and read essays by Tom Machiavelli, Lynn Zelevansky, or of course Yvan Amboise. Interestingly enough, it is actually Morellet's awareness of another artist, Joseph Albers, and his perceptual abstraction based on color experiments that led Morellet not to pursue this line of inquiry. According to Yvan Amboise again, Albers was another hero in Morellet's canon, who offered with his Homage to the Square series begun in 1950, masterful demonstrations that which Morellet felt couldn't be surpassed. So the reason why Morellet, who usually worked in series, or at least variations on the similar system or idea, decided to keep Du Jaune au Violet as one of his rare one-of-a-kind exceptions is probably his knowledge of the work by Albers. That said, the most crucial precedent here is probably lying with another artist, yet another one. And it is Kazimir Malevich and his occasional practice of orientation indeterminacy. In other words, the Russian artist flipped some of his paintings from one exhibition to the next, deliberately and obviously challenging the presumed necessary and often hierarchical orientation toward a designated top versus bottom and left side versus right side. And I'm quoting from Krohn and Moos. The landmark show, entitled The Last Futurist Exhibition of Painting 010, presented in 1915 in the city called at the time Petrograd, presented new modes of abstractions. It included the breakthrough display of suprematist works by Kazimir Malevich. Of this show, I believe exist only 2 installation views, and this is one of the 2, the only one featuring the works of Malevich. And the show is also a breakthrough because it presented for the first time Malevich's iconic black square, which was famously installed high up in a corner, over here, alongside 38 other paintings, which was the first also massive demonstration of Malevich's endeavor into non-objective painting. In his own words, Malevich was trying desperately to free art from the dead weight of the real world. And one way Malevich found to free painting was to literally turn conventions upside down and altering the orientation of certain of his works. If you look here in the installation view, we have up here painterly realism of a football player, color masses in a 4th dimension. And down here, suprematist composition, airplane flying, both executed in 1915. I'm showing you here color reproductions of the works I just mentioned, exactly in the orientation in which they were displayed at the 010 exhibition. While both works were subsequently included in the 16-state exhibition in Moscow in 1920, and in 1927 in the Polish Art Club in Warsaw, and both were exhibited upside down. An even more spectacular example may be the entitled Suprematist Construction of 1916, also included in Moscow, was later on hung not only upside down, but also sideways. So this work totals 3 different orientation options. Orientation clearly here has become a device of extreme versatility to address essential questions about painting and display, where treating the exhibition space and our perception of it as an apparatus becomes as important to address as the content of the pictorial plane. It is true that in Morellet's case, such versatility in orientation was the fruit not only of a conceptual position, he did believe in the autonomy of his systems, les bérets basques, right? But it also resulted sometimes from circumstances. He accepted that sometimes one must adjust to exhibitions' contingencies. And when there's not enough room, Morellet willingly adapts and turns, for instance, his inaugural neon work from 1963, which was truly an installation. This is what you have here on the left. It was initially shown in a black room, a black chamber, and each of the 4 panels would go on its own wall, right? And then it was hung as one big square, configured on one wall, all 4 panels put together. But I think truly what motivated such versatility of pictorial orientation with Morellet was his taste for playful provocation. In a 1989 interview, when he was asked about the influence of Russian avant-garde on his art, Morellet stated, "I consider myself an irreverent child of the suprematist and constructivist movements." he added, "I believe that the main difference between Malevich's time and ours is this wonderful invasion of humor." Beyond the spectacular gesture of orientation versatility and the instrumental category of destabilization that it contributed creating, and I will come back to that notion in a moment, I think lies an even deeper and far more far-reaching form of versatility at the heart of Morellet's practice, and which I think could be summarized as follows: when serial systematicity meets conceptual frivolity. Morellet loved frivolity. He loved the term, he loved the idea. He actually even didn't hesitate to qualify his entire method as frivolous, as opposed to rational, and even read his whole career through the prism of said frivolity. And I'm quoting, "Discrete in the 50s and the 60s, established in the 70s and the 80s, frivolity is triumphant today." And that was a quote from 1996. Morellet's levity and irreverence toward the history of geometric abstraction was present, again, if only discreetly at first, but was present from the very beginning. Playing against the traditional notion of composition, and we heard that this morning already, the very word composition is actually a no-no in Morellet world. He conferred the same importance to each component of his serial structures. Uniformly drawn and covering the entire surface of the work, the rectilinear pattern seems to imply a virtually infinite extension beyond the borders of the picture, as in an all-encompassing geometric continuum. And from 1958 on, Morellet deepens his irreverence toward pictorial conventions, attempting now not only to eradicate, but also, and I quote, to ridicule, to parody composition by adopting chance factor as organizing principle. We have here 4 random distribution of squares following numbers 3, 1, 4, 1, 5, 9, etc., also known as the first 16 digits from the irrational number pi. But it's true with all the other works relying on found numerical sequences, such as, and we learned a bit about it this morning, the numbers from Morellet's local phone directory. Are they random, are they not? We can pursue that conversation later. The aim, in any case, by Morellet is to depersonalize as much as possible the process of decision-making. Another example of random distribution, this time of triangles, using the even and odd numbers of the same set phone directory. Well, incidentally, from 1958 on, the year of its execution, and although it was clearly conceived originally as a 3-part work, we have installation views back then from the artist's studio testifying of it. Well, even that, only the first panel, so the one to the left, was exhibited between 1958 and 1981. According to the inventory card at the Morellet archives, the other 2 panels were retrieved in 1981 from the family house attic. They'd been put there, and it's only then in 1981, peut-être un ménage de printemps, someone cleaned up and found them. The complete work could be shown for the first time, actually, at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. To this day, it really remains a mystery why the artist had conceived it this way, was put else somewhere, forgotten about, and then, in a sense, amputated of its to several elements. But more generally, Morellet had what he called a programmed experimental form of painting. And the works would be fully conceived prior to execution, with this ambition to, again, do as little as possible. In other words, to have to take the fewest decisions possible. His enterprise really was to tend toward meaningless next to nothingness, his words. And this can only be attained through a drastic reduction of subjective arbitrariness. Well, ironically, the one work that Morellet considered to be his most pared down, his most reduced, 16 squares, which we've seen earlier today, a black and white painting of 3 lines intersecting 3 perpendicular lines, in other words, an orthogonal grid, or, in Morellet's terminology, and that is rather important, une double trame, a double grid. And that double grid is positioned on the panel at a regular 0-90-degree angle, so a right angle facing the viewer. Well, that very, very simple painting still required 11 arbitrary decisions in order to determine format, content, distribution, color, material. Paradoxically, Morellet's most pared down work also turned out to be his most fertile. 16 squares became Morellet's matrix. He constantly revisited and further developed the basic structure of his seminal work, offering a remarkable demonstration of how seemingly rudimentary systems developed logically through the modification or multiplication of simple parameters can generate a vast range of complex variations. Through a meticulous process of addition or permutation, superimposing in a series of trames, grids rotated at various angles. And this is where you have almost this idea of stop motion, geometry in motion, but stage by stage. Morellet unfolded precise combinations of interlacing networks. At first, the grids were rather spare and widely spaced. This is what we see here with the Citram in yellow from 1958. But the networks grew increasingly dense, often producing vivid optical effects through circular and star-shaped motifs, yet still merely using the same simple module of the double trame. When you look at it closely, it's really always this perpendicular grid that is taken with its right angle and just rotated at different angles. And those angles are specified in the title. The artist always wanted to make sure that the content or the logic of the system would be clear and accessible to anyone. He first made them with oil paint. Then he moved on using silk screens. And he even used unexpected materials, such as wire mesh, here with the double trame de grillage. And that's where Morellet's versatility unfolds also at the favor of various formal treatments, often calling material readily available at the Morellet-Guérineau family factory. He had access there to metal shops and qualified workers who would work for Monsieur Morellet, this time the artist, and they would work usually on Saturdays. And that allowed Morellet to expand his exploration of the orthogonal grid. Sphère-Trame, a series begun in 1962, embodied the 80 by 80 centimeter grid, painted grid, and gave it the third dimension. It was fabricated in metal, and that became a series that eventually ranged in size from a small multiple of 60 centimeters in diameter, up to, I think, over 5 meters. And I'm showing you here, to the right, an example in Wuppertal in Germany, where the Sphère-Trame measures over 3 meters and weighs over 750 kilos. While Morellet also returned to his 16 squares for a mesmerizing interactive work called Reflections in Water Distorted by the Spectator. That was part of his Grave years. Maybe you've seen it in the show. So it's the same grid, this time made out of neon, mounted on the ceiling, positioned with, some water on the floor in such a way that the reflection will be perfectly centered. And then the visitor is invited to use a handle and distort the reflection on water. Interestingly enough, some 40 years later, Morellet transposed his wall-mounted neon works, the distorted reflection, as he documented them with photographs. And furthermore, he had used those photographs, given them to 3-year-old children, and asked them to redraw those distorted grids with the colors of their choice. And that's why you see in the title, after Théo, 3 years old, after François Morellet, 27-year-old, because that was his age at the time of reflections, distorted, and watery, la la. Significantly, the original French title of this series, Recréation or Récréation, actually suggests 2 ideas. The first one is of a remake, a recreation, but it also means recess in school, playtime. Well, playfulness and the strong sense of experimentation are truly characteristic of Morellet's approach to art making. And this is now something we know he kept from his years with Grave. And the collaboration at the time, which still led to individual works, well, at least allowed him to fully embrace this versatile tendency to turn smaller 2-dimensional works, and painting mostly, into large sculptural installations. During his Grave years, we know that his black and white double trame became the sphère trame. Or his 40,000 squares, the painting, became a huge environment where the 40,000 squares were printed on wallpaper. Well, in 1968, the very year the group disbanded, Morellet continued to venture into the architectural scale and created his very first site-specific, yet potentially infinitely recitable tape pieces. First installed, of all places, in a nightclub. It was in a club called La Playa in Fréjus, near Saint-Tropez in the south of France. Well, the piece was, of course, a superimposed grid, or more colloquially called within the Morellet family, a spider grid. The ephemeral pieces would then be applied to all kinds of surfaces, from exhibition walls, of course, but also to facades, vitrines, and as we see here on the right, even to paintings or sculptures by other artists. It is true, at time iconoclast, Morellet's geometry relies above all on constraints and their displacement or deconstruction. The early idea of versatile orientation, which we discussed earlier, morphed into another kind of displacement. And that's what Morellet called the tilting quality. And this gained, as you can see here, spectacular stature with his first architectural integration, or, as Morellet enjoyed joking about, his architectural disintegration. Yet another orthogonal grid, here skewed by just 3 degrees to the right and to the left. The tilting quality is truly part of a broader conceptual category of destabilization, which in Morellet's classification came after juxtaposition, superimposition, fragmentation, interference, and randomization. Maintaining his commitment to systematic geometry, the artist continued to use patterns, such as here, uniformly dispersed parallel line, but now introducing a new instrumental factor, the tilted angle. The artist's production remained diverse throughout his career. He carried out multiple disruptions in its geometric systems without ever appending, though, his core principles. Morellet's new development led to innovative bodies of works that proved to be both systematic and eccentric at the same time. And this is true of what he called the outside of painting, what he understood as the medium's materiality and apparatus in relationship to the exhibition space and its perception or apprehension by the visitor. During the 1970s, the artist became more and more interested in what happens around rather than inside the pictorial plane, starting with the conventional floor-wall relationship. From then on, he playfully created works relying on unusual positioning or orientation in space, the blank canvases becoming the mere markers of verticality and horizontality, provoking conceptual collisions between the logic of presenting art and the logic of art representing, if anything. And there was a very early precedent to this. Arc of Circle broken in 4, dated 1954. Morellet here considered painting as an object in space, and the constraints of the display in space should be challenged. According to the artist, the work constituted, and I quote, an opening toward the irony of the tableau, a radically different approach which attempted to break the form rather than to reduce it to its purest state. I mean, let's keep in mind, 16 carré squares dates from 53. Just the year after, 54, we have this arc of circle broken in 4. He fragmented the pictorial surface into 4 planes. Each panel is separated by a regular interval, and the element drawn over it of the arc is slightly misaligned, challenging the viewer's perception. Paradoxically, the more it disrupts aesthetic conventions, the more rigid the system is. In the same letter to Germain Viat, mentioned earlier, Morellet indicated that yes, du jaune au violet can be hung pretty much any which way, but Arc de Cercle Brisé must follow a specific orientation and spacing so that the system can function. The constant regeneration of Morellet's system was enabled precisely by this style versatile. But when thinking about it, it's truly an anti-style, or to quote the artist again, a great inconstance, so inconstancy, of the styles. And those styles actually help disguise his system as rigorous, as absurd. And this precisely allowed him to range from what he called pseudo-transcendental minimalism all the way to frivolous pseudo-Baroque. It is under the influence of late Baroque architecture from South Germany and Austria that in the 1990s, François Morellet's oeuvre entered a Baroque minimalist period. He called it also a Baroque concrete period, where he facetiously tended to deconstruct primary shapes. Lamentable, the work that we're seeing here, could be translated maybe as despicable. This could be a perfect circle. Morellet decided instead to let it just dangle from the ceiling. Or another example of that Baroque minimalist period is the Relâche series, a Baroque bouquet of 4 deconstructed squares. This mixed media series was started in 1992. And it, first of all, is a compendium of all the materials that the artist had adopted up to that point. Oil paint, acrylic, adhesive tape, flat iron, and neon. The title indicates it is an homage to Francis Picabia's 1924 ballet and its provocative title. In French theater, relâche means that a show is either not played a certain day or fully cancelled. Morellet's title also means, in his context, and this time literally in French, relâche is a rest or a loosening, presumably of Morellet's rigorously minimal processes. But actually not quite, because behind the seemingly chaotic arrangements here lies this familiar organizing principle sourced in the sequences of phone numbers. All 8 pairs of right angles follow the coordinates that are rigorously, albeit randomly, provided by the numbers from page 313 from the Maine-et-Loire phone directory. And eager to make his system fully transparent, He really wanted to prove to his viewers that he never cheated with the preset rules that he had adopted. Morellet hired a notary public so that he could issue an official legal statement confirming that the artist scrupulously followed the declared system. For the very first exhibition of this series, he actually even included that statement in the gallery. In a similar manner, the seemingly arbitrary arabesques follow here again another mathematical formula that the artist really enjoyed, the decimals of the pi number, where here each digit is multiplied by 10 to obtain the angles joining the neon arcs. And this is why you see in the title, 1 = 10 degrees. In a text entitled The Course of Pi, Morellet explains again, and I quote, "I eventually came to realize that one of the capacities of my systems, and not the least, was to simulate, to parody authentic artistic movements, illustrated by real masterpieces executed by real artists and involving innumerable subjective and brilliant decisions. I knew, of course, that my systems could disguise simple elements into pseudo-constructivist works. And I accepted that fact, but I did not like those systems enough then to let them do whatever they could. But now I do, with pseudo-impressionism, pseudo-expressionism, up to pseudo-rococo." And I would add, he even did pseudo-Morlaise. In 2006, with the comically titled title, "When I Was Little, I Didn't Do Big," the artist created a parody of his own art. He decided to replicate a selection of works from his pivotal year of 1952, blowing up their size by 4. The Radical series constitute the most provocative demonstration of the artist's predilection for repetition and anti-composition. And there was a good reason for it. It was not just like a gratuitous gesture like that. He felt that he somewhat underestimated the question of scale as a young painter, especially compared with his American peers. And he believed that his 52x4 series managed to more obviously achieve the intended impression of immersive infinity hinted by his early all-over paintings. In a statement that I think lies between ambition and maybe self-consciousness, really, Morellet wrote, "I would not want people to believe that with these very minimalist works I am positioning myself before the Americans, and that the fact that I had made them in a small format is just a detail. It's not true. I did not have the guts to realize them in a large size, and that's my great mistake. Scale was the great invention of the Americans. I had not understood Bernard Newman or Jackson Pollock because I'd only seen their paintings in reproduction. When I discovered them, I realized that their dimension changed everything." And of course, the rigorous jokester as he was, as in an irresistible escalation of the conceptual joke in that same exhibition at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris in 2006. Not only did Morellet show the blown-up versions of their original miniatures, and both together in the space, but he pushed the absurdity and self-irony to the extreme and decided, like a vice versa moment, to reduce by 4 a very large work from 1975, which he titled, "When I Was Big, I Did Too Big." Through the question of scale, obviously, Morellet is commenting upon his place in contemporary history of geometric abstraction. He's perhaps one of the most dadaist of conceptual artists. And here's one of the last questions that he asked. What happens when the walls of museums and private collections are already full? Metaphorically, what he's asking is like, what to do as an artist when all art history seats seem to all be taken? Well, Morellet comes up with a very convenient and rather elegant solution in the shape of 3 right angles combined into one metal piece, for which Morellet is convinced there will always be room. Le bouche-trou, or called the filler. And here's what he says in his for real sale flyer, which you can see here. What a dramatic situation where a collector doesn't have any space left for a work of art. Apparently not a single spot left for any painting, even less so for a sculpture, while desires and resources are plenty. Well, the filler, a superb and highly contemporary sculpture, will know where to find space. It will humbly squeeze in between paintings, for which it may also act as frame. This accessory is so often disregarded nowadays by negligent artists. As it happens, among the illustrations of Morellet print is an installation view of Malevich's construction of the 010 exhibition. And as you can see, among the suprematist masterpieces, Morellet has inserted his versatile sculpture, which of course can be hung in any orientation. Thank you. And here we are again. Thank you for still being here with us. So we thought, after trying to absorb so much information and new scholarship, really, in many ways, on François Morellet, we could try to talk among each other and then with you guys and see whether there's anything they would like to further investigate, maybe clarify, or even have further remarks on the topic. Maybe we could, it's just an idea to get started, just like stop me if it's not a good idea. But I feel that in all three presentations, this ambition towards a science of art or a certain experimental scientific approach was present in not only chronologically or historically, but in all the conceptual approaches that three of you guys had. So I was wondering maybe if there's anything you'd like to elaborate or comment upon.
I mean, I think at least in the Grave period, this interest in the word clarity gets used a lot. I think various of us cited it, and part of that's linked to concrete art as well. But this idea that something could be a little bit more objective. I mean, the difference for me with Morellet is his element of chance kind of shakes all that up a bit, but certainly the language in the texts of the time was about being a researcher and being like a scientist and having this level of objectivity as against the extreme subjectivity that was the articulation of art informel and Taoism in that generation. So, and then equally, it somehow leaks into the political or the ideological, where the idea of the team is something that has to do with the collective. Sometimes it gets linked back to the notion back in the cathedrals that collective was producing, but then there's also that moment where the politics of so many of them, we were hearing about Lukács. I mean, there were these things that were informing the way of thinking that had to do with the objectivity and science, the science of thinking rather than just the emotion of the artist.
You mentioned, Alex, Gestalt theory, for instance. I think that would also quite be connected to this idea of a scientific approach. To what extent do you think Morellet really adopted? Because in Gestalt theory, it seems that there's maybe Gestalt is shape, form in German. There's the appropriate form, or there's the right form for a certain process.
Is it scientific?
Yeah, is it scientific, or is this something that was truly central to Morellet's work, maybe even through the idea of information theory, because I think that's something that was crucial for François and Vera Molnar, for instance.
Information theory, a bit later. It's interesting. It'd be good to really parse out how he understood Gestalt theory. The notion of Gestalt that he seems to have picked up from the context of Brazil that I was talking about earlier is one that was more related to design, and that's how the school of Ulm was a school of design, right? And it's a school of Gestalt, teaching of design. Ulm, to be clear, was the post-war Bauhaus in Europe, and so the science would be, what happens at the school of Ulm? What happens with the Max Bill teaching? Well, what happens is that...
and he was the director there, I believe, right? Max Biel was also the director of the...
He was the director.
Right, in the early 50s.
Yeah, he was the director of the School of Ulm. He was the founder. founding director. And what returns is functionalism. And what's really very interesting, the artwork having a function. And what's very interesting is this fabulous debate that takes place between Max Bill and Asger Jorn in the early 1950s, because Asger Jorn, the early proto-situationists, Asger Jorn, had formed into this group with Constant and a couple of others that called themselves the Imaginist Bauhaus. And so when Bill is putting together the science, the School of Ulm, which was another Bauhaus, Bill contacted Asger Jorn and asked him to join. And Asger Jorn at that time, at the very end of the Imaginist Bauhaus, some of the Letters International people, like Guy Debord, and let's not forget, Joel Stein was a fellow traveler of the Lettres. He was there, so Joel Stein is in this dialogue. So what's interesting is that when Bill asks Jorn to join the Imaginist Bauhaus with the School of Ulm that he's putting together, Jorn responds with vitriol, saying, you're just trying to make, to give art a function, when in fact art is the complete opposite. Art is about play. So that's a very interesting dialogue. They're letters that one can track down there. And it'd be great to find out where Morellet is in this, right? I mean, he's not a member of the discussion back and forth, but peripherally he's located somewhere with Joel Stein and with Mavigné and
and Mavigné also. Max Spencer was a pioneer of information theory teaching at Ulm, and that texts related to that were published in the Journal of Zero. So again, I can't draw the direct line into Morellet, but that was in the air. Compatriots were thinking about that and how it played into how you were perceiving and producing art.
Who else was teaching at Ulm was Albers. You started off with Albers. He was a professor in the summer. He would go there in between. At that time, he was in between the Black Mountain and Yale, and he went to Ulm and he was teaching the foundations course there. So it does loop around quite interestingly. These are histories that haven't been told. I have to say, Valerie's the only one that's really gotten into some of this history in her writings on the Nouvelle Tendance, which leads me to a question. And that is that, I noticed when you were talking about the Nouvelle Tendance, that it was plural initially. Mm-hmm. And then when Grave gets involved, with Morellet and Leparc and these people get involved, they make it singular. Mm-hmm. So what's up with that?
Well, there were obviously a lot of vocabularies used around exhibitions and this younger generation trying to find their label, and different things were batted back and forth for the title of that show, but there was this idea of plurality, right? Because Manzoni is in that first show, and if I remember correctly, he's in there with his artist shit. I mean, actually, Merde d'Artista. And this, of course, is a great insult to the true concrete artists. Which is why this neo-Dada nuance gets criticized in the Grave text in 1962 in part. But there was this idea that all these different things were happening, and so in 1960, in the exhibition and the journal for Azimuth, that's the new conception of art. There's this idea of using new constantly. Is it singular? Is it plural? But yes, I do think that what my kind of working theory has always been that Grave and some of their generationally similar artists were looking to find a platform in the way that Zero had become a platform for the earlier generation, because Zero was not just the group, as I've argued. It was an international consortium of artists who appeared in different shows with different names, not always Zero. And in fact, the big tension that arises in the polemic is between Zero. Like Zero gets excommunicated more or less at a certain point, and these younger artists quite early on in that. So I think that there was this idea to try to find something that was coherent and singular and had an actual definition. In 1962, it's not yet able to say with clarity what they are, but they work towards that. And then within a year, or less than a year, they've added on the continuous research piece, which is not lost, of course, on its relationship to the Grave's name, and also just to the scientific basis that they and others were talking about.
It's just interesting to go from new tendencies, and then when they move to the Grave studio for their discussions, it becomes the new tendency.
And even their text, Nouvelle Tendance, it's not with an S. As far as I remember, it's a singular. So I think it happens at a quite early point. And then the next show in Zagreb in 1963, which goes on to Italy and Germany, carries the singular.
Now, speaking of artist shit, I believe that there was a trade with Manzoni for an artwork, and because Manzoni refused to pay Morellet, Morellet said, "You got to pay me."
Well, it's not that he
So sent
refused; he couldn't quite afford it. It's different. It was a trade, yeah.
Manzoni could afford it. Manzoni that money wasn't the issue for Manzoni, so it was something else.
There's a lot of stories about Manzoni and money, though, I have to tell you.
Manzoni was going to give only one can of shit.
And he says, "That's not enough shit."
François said, I want two. I want to upper one to know if you're not full of shit.
Did he open them?
No, we never opened it. Thank God, because now it's worth a lot more.
But then maybe it's like relating back to the idea of taking one's distance with subjectivity. But in a sense, wasn't it quite a semi-failure with Grave? Because there was this ambition to create collectively, but truly there were barely any works that were really collective, and then they all went back to their individual practices. And I think the question of anonymity is quite different from impersonal or desubjectivized, for instance.
Let's emphasize this. It was really Morellet who wanted it to be collective. He was the one that was always pushing for collectivity, and it was Huli Leparc and a few of the others that said, no, we want to keep our own individual practice going.
I'm curious, Daniel, in Neolipo, truly collective works, does it happen?
It happens, certainly never that I can think of under truly anonymous conditions, but there are projects. There's some projects that happen collectively, but what I think happens, what is more properly Oulipian is a sort of collective work over time, in which somebody, often Perec, sort of starts something, and then a few years later somebody will pick up where he left off, whether it's taking a form and tweaking it or perverting it, or whether it's writing a sequel to something that he wrote. And so there's a lot of kind of internal iteration that it doesn't start out conceived as being a collective work, but it becomes a collective work over time.
But you mentioned also the importance of certain forms of interactivity. One of your notes out of the 99 said the interactivity between, if you compare between Morellet and Oulipo, are of different kinds.
Yep.
So I was wondering, what's the kind of the...
It's funny, that note, I went through a few different versions of how I was going to compare the interactivity. First I said fundamentally different, and I said not that different, and I wound up with just different.
Different kinds.
When you think of, so that's part of why I mentioned that Queneau, as far as I know, invented the choose your own adventure story. Mm-hmm. It's this idea of text as something that's not, as one of you put it, it's not, I'm going to try to find it in my notes, perception is a direct activity. It's not something that just lays there on the page for you to come and take it away. You actually have to engage. You have to give something of yourself and, in a certain sense, become complicit in the project of turning writing into reading. And that attention to the readerly experience is certainly not present everywhere in the Oulipian canon, such as it is, but I think it's a lot of the best works, and in particular I'm thinking of If on a Winter's Night a Traveler by Italo Calvino, which is really explicitly attentive to what the reader is doing, to the point where the first page of the book, it begins saying, "Dear reader, welcome to If on a Winter's Night a Traveler by Italo Calvino. Put your feet up, make yourself comfortable, unplug the phone, and this sort of thread of what you, the reader, are doing continues throughout the novel.
What year is that novel?
79. I guess another example of interactivity worth pointing out, not to go on too long, but is Queneau made a work called 100,000 billion poems, 100 milliards de poèmes, which is a collection of 10 sonnets that all have the exact same rhyming structure. And they were printed, and lines were cut between each line of each sonnet. So in theory, it becomes this flip-flap book that I wish I had an image of, that the reader can actually physically turn the flaps and decide to, for instance, read the first line of the first sonnet, the second line from the third sonnet, the third line from the eighth sonnet, and so on, which theoretically engenders 10 to the 14th possible distinct sonnets, all having the same rhyme scheme. So that's just fundamentally interactive. Like, it requires the reader to actually make the sonnets being read.
And it seems also fundamentally systematic and completely irrational. Isn't it something that is so true to Morellet's work as well?
Yeah, definitely.
It's also taken from children's books.
Oh.
I'm sure that's the source to that.
But Daniel, what about the humor? I mean, I loved your presentation, and I have to say I laughed a bunch too. What about and you say you're capturing something. How would you describe the humor that is involved? Or first of all, is there, or were you accenting that beyond? Because I would argue, so what is the extent of humor in Morellet's work, and what kind of humor would you say that it was?
So I'm, I feel like I'm farthest from an expert here, but
from your point of view as a writer, it's all right.
The way I read Morellet's relationship to humor, on the primary way I read it, which is verbal, because that's kind of the primary way I read everything, is that over the course of his career, he sort of tried for a while to deny a place to this verbal sense of humor that he had. And toward the end, when he started having these puns for his titles and really pursuing that, I read it as sort of a capitulation to saying I can no longer deny that language is this really powerful, elemental way of not only communicating with people but conceiving what I'm trying to do.
Why do you think that happens?
My sense is sort of late 70s, early 80s. But then there's this other kind of humor, which is, which I think you were getting at in this insistence on being able to orient a painting in whatever way you want. And there's a note that I like in one of his essays about giving the purchaser of one of his works the option of adding their signature to his on the back, and if they like, erasing his signature with the eraser provided for that particular purpose. So I think there's this will to, this sort of impish will to kind of buck the institutional current of art in the various incarnations it took.
And in a sense, the very first institution of art is the artist. Mm-hmm. And that was very clear during the Grave years, but even before that, the first mystification that Morellet was fighting against was the romantic figure of the genius, sensitive, tortured artist, or not tortured, but still very irritating, and constructing a whole aura or charisma, and then leading to a cult of personality. Mm-hmm. And this is the first thing that Morellet was against, which then actually led to difficult situations because he was so, I think, humble and sometimes self-deprecating that some people would not take him seriously. He even joked often, speaking of language and demystification, because he was very popular, well exhibited, well collected in Germany very early on. And he often joked that the only reason why he had such a success is because Germans wouldn't understand his jokes.
Just on the genius note, there's another line that I like from one of his essays, I think around a similar time, where he says, he concludes this essay by saying, if we could eliminate the word genius from the vocabulary around art, it would be great. And the way he says it would be great in French is ce serait génial.
Yeah, he said it would be genius.
It would be genius if we could stop saying. And that's kind of what I mean about this sort of lifelong, what I read as a lifelong struggle with how do you articulate your desire to not have to articulate anything? How do you confront the fact that you want to overthrow language, you want to sort of buck the tyranny of language as the expressive medium that we all share, but how do you do that if the way you want to do that is verbal, is through
And you know who he quotes then? He quotes a stand-up comedian, Raymond DeVos. Like really, like to say, well, I really don't want to say anything, but the hardest thing about it is have to say it. Like, how do you say that you have nothing to say? And then he quotes a comedian, like a really well-known comedian who never made it in the US. But yes, really well-known. I think Florent has some.
There's also his pornographic art.
It's true that we did not mention his pseudo-pornographic, right? He said pseudo. Which is a very visual form of humor, it is true. Even though not graphic, because you don't see anything truly shocking. Do you want to explain what this series is?
Yes. It's a series he did in the 80s, right? Yes. And it's... so you have either square...
They're blank canvases, right? Yeah, it's blank. There's no image.
Yes, either square or tall rectangulars, and they're put on the wall, against the wall, and so does so you.
Oh, you're gonna mind me.
So you have a square one like this, and you have a rectangular one like that, and this one would be called comment on dit en français the blowjob, like
well, there's one that's called from behind, and this. Oh,
okay,
yeah. So you use these phrases.
You have two tall ones. Yes, it's from behind. You have three tall ones together. So it's like a threesome. You have and it.
And I think the title of the series is Geometry in Spasms.
Oui, géométrie dans l'espace. Yes, yes. So I just wanted to.
There's a pun again, dans l'espace, dans l'espasme. It's just homophonic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, this was one of his volumes. I don't think it's sold.
This is not why we didn't talk about it. We're just total Puritans. That's what it is.
Always American.
Exactly. Well, maybe it's actually time to open the conversation to the audience. Maybe anyone would like to make a comment or have a question. Yes.
In order to make these points, I need to introduce a concept, shared sensibility. And so that sensibility in the United States perhaps starts with Black Mountain and then is continued at Yale. And the person who is in between Yale and Black Mountain was mentioned, Albers. So I wonder how much contact there was between people like Morellet and those two traditions.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned a second ago, I don't know that Morellet met Albers at Ulm, but Albers was teaching at Ulm while he was at Black Mountain before he got to Yale. Now, I forget the actual year that Albers gets to Yale. Is it 56? So, it was in the 60s. Okay, so Albers, we know that Morellet visited the School of Ulm at least 2 times.
And my understanding is he did meet Albers.
He did meet him. Okay, so and you can see the color Oh, okay. So there's the answer. So there's a direct relationship to that legacy, which, as you know, then at Yale turns into the legacy of the minimalists, which then claim they'd never heard of Morellet. I mean, you know, that's not to say anybody's taking from anybody, but it's a part of a general discussion, so that they reach similar conclusions shouldn't be a surprise. That takes us.
Were there any joint exhibitions that somebody other than the particular artist would have put together? Somebody who saw a relationship.
Was Albers in the responsive eye?
I think so, yeah. I'm pretty sure.
You know, and the responsive eye, maybe we should spend 2 minutes on it.
Responsive I had also Kelly and Stella and Bridget Riley and many of other artists that we've mentioned, really.
And it was the death knell for the Europeans and the apotheosis of the Americans. And remember, you know, you have people like Frank Stella in his discussion with Bruce Glazer and Donald Judd saying, you know, that Max Bill stuff, it's, you know, it's limited. It doesn't resonate here in the United States. I'm misquoting him here, but something like that. And he's dismissing flat out that.
Stella said that the art of all those geometric abstract European painters was dreary and had nothing to do with his own.
You mean unlike the black paintings, yeah. But anyway, so there's a direct, it's a shared sensibility. I think that's a good way of putting it, actually. They weren't. That's why I don't go for the idea of plagiarism in the visual arts in that context. I think it's just they're arriving at similar conclusions because they're all thinking about the same type of problems.
Yeah, and I would argue that this is also the era of international art magazines, and I think, you know, the reproduction comment was really interesting. It's probably was more often the case that someone saw something in a really bad black and white small reproduction, but there was a lot of ink spilled on all of these things. Some of it was in English, so even Americans were looking at those magazines, vice versa. So I think that there was also some kind of, for the Europeans working in different countries, there was those few moments in exhibitions where they had this aha, oh my gosh, you're doing the same thing I am. You're worried about some of the same things. You dislike some of the same things. So I actually, this is definitely that moment of art magazines that I think actually they played a really important role. And Responsive Eye is definitely a great case where so much ink was spilled, much of it very pejorative. And talking, because, you know, as Bridget Riley's writing in from the airport, she's seeing dresses that look like her paintings in the, you know, the shop windows, and it's that, you know, Vasarely himself who's getting kind of, on the one hand, trying to draw certain boundaries, but then there are all these commercial aspects to the work. So I agree, your shared sensibility is really important because people were coming up and we weren't as interconnected as we are today, but some of the experiences were in common. You were living in an era where things were starting to shift and change. And I think what's interesting, at least in much of certainly what Alex and I were focusing on today, is it does mostly predate 68, which is another, like the early 60s and the later 60s are very different moments, which I think we need to, when we always say the 60s, it's important to draw that distinction, I think.
Beatrice, I wonder, you began with that wonderful picture with the factory and the children. You sort of touched on this before, but I wonder if you could speak more about the degree to which you think that economic independence and also a very different sense of self, having been a factory director, plays into the fact that of all the group in Grave, he is able to dismiss this idea of the individual because he has an alternate individuality, one could say. But then I wonder also if you could touch on the degree to which you think, and Laurent may speak to this too, but the materiality of the production of the factory works into both the sort of science of Grave, but his work generally.
No, it's very true. François Morellet was born to a rather well-off family, worked for the family business, which was for a long time a very successful business. And he actually prided himself on having known no pressure whatsoever from the market, because he had none. First of all, there was no market for him. He didn't sell a single work, I think, for the first 10 years, between 52 and 61. But he didn't need to. And very often he said, well, actually, it was a complete liberation for me, because then he was an artist. He could only work again, as mentioned, not as much as he would have wanted, but at least he was completely free to pursue the most radical form of art that was dear to him, without wondering, oh my, how am I gonna, pay my bills, or am I gonna sell? Like, is there pressure from my dealers? Because you could tell that this is more successful than other things. So it's almost like a blessing in disguise having to work for the family business and being totally free from it. He actually not only was very free and emancipated from such contingencies, but he was also very generous. I learned along the way that he supported peers, fellow artists who were struggling, sometimes in kind. Albert Skelly, at some point during his years in Paris, lost his studio and his apartment, didn't know where to go. Morellet's parents, who lived in Paris and owned a chambre de bonne, a tiny little studio in a older building. Well, Albert Skelly stayed there for months, I think. Or am I exaggerating? Maybe 2 months. But for a little while. And then Morellet acquired some works, bought works. And actually, I think this is how he got in conversation, or discontinued conversation with Joseph Albers, is that he acquired, I think in the 60s or late 60s, a drawing of a new series by Albers. So not part of the series of Homage to the Squares, but more his architectural seeming, plain constructions. And he was the first one to buy it from the series. Albers reached out to Morellet to thank him, saying, my dealer told me you were the one who bought the first one of the series, which was not particularly successful then. So that's one thing. The fact that he worked for the factory was also, of course, both empowering for him, but on the way, it was preventing him, and it was a relief in 1975, 76, when he could finally dedicate his entire time to art making. But by that time, he was successful enough that he would be invited to numerous shows, was working with numerous dealers, so then he could also live off his art. The factory was finally a really important access point, in very practical terms, because yes, he had access to different materials, or even it just came up, because he could see every day in the factory that there was wire mesh and metal and I mentioned, of course, the qualified workers who helped in build those sculptures. But you know what? Most of the silk screens made in the 60s, and then he continued on in the 70s, because again, he gave a painting, mostly in the 60s, were made by assistants. Most of them worked at the factory and would come over to his house and use the silk, the screens, and then wash them and help Morellet make them. So the importance, in a very practical terms, of the factory is definitely crucial.
Now, when I came to New York, I became very close to my New York artist adoptive parents, Christo and Jean-Claude, and they were very similar to my parents. And so in this discussion, I want to bring the name of Danielle Morellet, because she is extremely crucial in the success of my father, and from the get-go. And she allowed him, like Jean-Claude allowed Christo, the two of them being the artists, and whenever galleries or museum directors would come, and my father would show the art, and then they would say, oh, okay, I would like to know, how much or whatever. And then he would go, oh, call my wife, But to this day, this show, the work that Beatrice is doing, that everybody's doing, is possible because of the incredible nature of Danielle. And I'd like you to share that a little bit.
Please, Danielle was instrumental during François' career. The archive that exists today, even all the correspondence, she was just, everything happened also thanks to her. It was true to back then, and it is true today. The collaboration couldn't be smoother, and she's so well informed, and we have access to just the most wonderful archives that I've seen. It's true. Thank you for mentioning it.
Well, Florent, I have a question for you, because as I was working on my paper on the 1950s, I was wondering to what extent music was important in the setting up of seriality that Morellet, that François sets up in the paintings that I was showing, the serial system. And your mother was a composer. She was a musician, right?
She was not. No, she was not a composer. She was a
virtuose. She was a very talented pianist.
Pianist. So she was an interpreter.
Yeah, more performer, interpreter.
But she could presumably take apart, because it was at that moment that there were very radical experiments in music, like Boulez.
Yeah, no, she was a performer. She was a pianist, a concert pianist.
And I think François' taste in music was really towards jazz. Yeah. I think he was passionate about contemporary jazz music.
Yeah, she stopped at my birth, 1953. That was it. You know, three children, and then she never went back. She just stopped, and then she took on, you know, the career of my father with a vengeance.
But could we presume that she knew about dodecaphonic, 12-tone serial music? But
she did. She was very thorough, very anal retentive, like she was with the piano, I would say. I mean, very systematic in the way she went with.
And I think François was aware and familiar and appreciated very much Steve Reich's music, for instance, but only became aware of John Cage's work much later.
I'm more interested in the Boulez dimension and Stockhausen and that stuff that was going on in the early 1950s, which a lot of visual artists were picking up on.
No, my mother liked classic. My father was jazz, and then, you know, the John Cage period and everything. But at 91 to come, you know, Danielle is unbelievable.
Danielle is turning 91 in May, and she's so sharp and fit and wonderful, full of life. Anyone else? Yes?
I just want to thank Dia for this and all of you, because the exhibition has really been a revelation for me and a lot of other artists. The question I wanted to ask is if you could talk a little bit more about the intervention work, and in particular the square hole piece at Dia.
Sure. It's a square piece of drawing paper hung on a wall, tilted by 5 degrees. There's a part of it cut out in the shape of a square that reveals a hole in the wall. So it's really the void. There's first an optical illusion, because by first looking at it, if you don't read the title carefully, you just think, well, maybe it's a black square drawn of a piece of paper, and then maybe you notice that it's a little skewed on the wall, but it's really a hole in the wall. And I think that's another example of this idea of the outside of painting, of thinking of painting as being, I mean, an object or an anti-object, really, but that relates to its own context of display. So it forces us to think about, oh, well, a white cube is maybe not so neutral as we thought. There's an interesting anecdote about it too, is that this piece was created initially for a collective exhibition, a group exhibition at the Pompidou in Paris in the early 80s that was called Walls, Bad Walls. And most artists were invited, and of course Sol LeWitt was one of them, to show one or several works that were wall-based. So most of them were wall drawings, wall paintings, etc. And initially, François Morellet thought he would do one of his tape pieces, and destabilizing architecture by outlining with a little angle, tilting it again. And then at the last minute, he was like, no. That it's like doing a retrospective and I'm going to just do the same, or like it's like a recipe and it's a wonderful thing that I could do elsewhere. But in this thing, last minute, I'm going to do the smallest works possible, and it's going to be about the void. And he said that it was like being on the verge of the void, au bord du vide. And that was just, I think, such a wonderful, beautiful new example of the next to nothingness. Tiny little intervention, and it changes everything. Someone? Oh, I think in the first row we had, I'm sorry, I don't mean to, but just to share the, thank you.
Daniel, you had a really good point early on about true objectivity not being possible, and I think that's something even in Morellet's later writings, that he kind of looks back on his early ideas and sees that that's not actually possible. And we've been talking so much about Groupe and so much about sort of the scientific rigor that they aspired to, but obviously that's something that's that one always falls short on, and I wonder if that's something that any of you wanted to say a little bit more about.
Well, I would say that for me, that all of that, the things I cited around 1968 kind of are that moment of admitting that's not as 100% about being able to be objective, but this idea, a lot of those aspirations, which at that moment, there was much more of a potentiality for utopian thinking than we could even imagine today. That real belief that you could create a method that could be used, that then also for the viewer, that the viewer could be given something that didn't require all this superfluous knowledge, that you didn't have to have read every book of mythology, that you could come to the thing and not be intimidated. And so that had a level of objectivity, right, that it didn't, and openness, and then that moment where it's, oh, everybody awoke without us. So, I mean, for me, I think that's an interesting way to think about it, that also, I was talking earlier about the pivot of the 60s. I mean, going from the late 60s into the 70s, in the West at least, where you begin to look at institutional critique, they're doing it, but it gets so intensified where there's almost this like inability to escape. They realize at a certain point you can't escape this. They admit early on you can't escape the system, then you really can, and then it just intensifies from them on, I think, at least in the context of Western Europe and the United States. Maybe not quite the world over, but yeah.
Just to pick up on that a little bit, I think objectivity occupies a very, very funny space in the Ulipo as a group that certainly has a lot bound up in the idea of scientific rigor, but I think and this is something that sort of became clear to me as I was putting together my talk and trying to think about some of the similarities between Morellet and the Ulipo in general, and this one seemed more of a divergence than a similarity in that I think whereas Morellet's quest for objectivity, although it sort of ebbed and flowed over the course of his career, I think for the Ulipo, objectivity has always seemed more important as a method, as a kind of a practical tool in the search of a deeper kind of subjectivity. Like I think there's no particular, to go back to the question of anonymity, there's no particular desire to eradicate, what Foucault called the author function. I think it was sort of always a given to the Ulipians that was inevitable. And it was much more on the side of the writer. How can you kind of trick yourself into not thinking about who you are as an author and think about what you're creating? And just to add to that, I think what Morellet brings into perspective a lot for me is this notion of self-sufficiency as a kind of objectivity, that you don't, as you were saying, you don't need to have read all of the mythology. The text teaches you to read it, or the piece of art sort of is consumable exhaustively, shall we say, just in your experience of and engagement with it. And that brings up, I think, if objectivity versus subjectivity isn't really a live topic of debate within the Ulipo, what is this question of whether or not you should reveal the constraint that gave rise to the text. And that's probably closest to an active, I wouldn't say it's polemical, but that's kind of an active question in the group. And some people say, it's a better experience for the reader to know that something is up, but not to know what it is, because that ensures this kind of engaged reading where you're really hooked in and you're looking for clues and you're just engaging in a way that if you were just reading a trashy pulp novel, you probably wouldn't be. On the other hand, there's some people who say, if you're doing it right, essentially, the constraint is going to have this inextricable relationship to the quality of the text that results. And to keep that from the reader is to keep him or her from being able to really appreciate it for all of what it is. If you take off the scaffolding, then you won't be able to appreciate the building for how it's constructed. You just have a much more superficial view of what you're looking at in that moment.
Which is interesting if you think about the two kinds of titles, right? The later, the puns and the wordplay versus the more descriptive and systematic titles. Like I know the first time I saw Lamentable, the idea that it was a complete circle broken into arcs never occurred to me, but I thought it was incredible, which is, of course, not revealing the system at play.
No, but it's true that Morellet was very much aware of the limitations, of the possibility of attaining truly objectivity. So he actually called it a tendance, a tendency, same word as the new tendencies. So someone in the back? Yes, thank you. And that might be our last questions, or maybe one more. Okay. Yeah, last question.
To come back to the idea of versatility and frivolity, and also to the fact that Morellet...
oh my God, you're wearing a beret.
Sorry?
Can you see?
And I'm
She's wearing a beret.
For the frivolity.
This is all set, it's staged, right?
And to the fact that Morellet didn't seem to take his art seriously throughout his career, I read that he destroyed some of his early paintings from the 1950s, and I would like to know what do you think about this, because I think it's not only to be annoying for the art historians that he did this.
Yeah, thank you. It's true. It's a very good question. That actually took place in the 1960s, precisely during his gravures. That is when he doubted, the very legitimacy of painting as a genre. So he didn't totally give it up, but he experimented it and maybe put it aside. And he destroyed close to 50 paintings, I think, that were part of the random distribution of 40,000 squares based on numbers from the directory. And what happened, and I think that's in a sense related also to Du Jaune au Violet, is that he made plenty of experiments with color. So he created a really much larger series that exists today, and realized that maybe this colorist approach had become, or it maybe diluted the strength or the relevance of the concept, and realized that maybe things became too pretty or too cute. So he did destroy, I think, close to half of the experiments that he had done at the time. It's true.
Just speaking about those paintings, since you did tease us earlier, you asked us if the numbers from Morellet's phone directory paintings were random or not. So are they?
Well, I think that's a question about it, because they are objectively random in the sense that Morellet really followed the sequence of the numbers as they came, starting with the page where his home number appeared. So I think they are random in that sense. But if you want to have a maybe post-Marxist structuralist reading, it is true that the sequence of phone numbers in a phone directory are maybe not scientifically, strictly speaking, random.
Why not?
Well, isn't it what you hinted at by saying that it's based on maybe geographical locations?
Right,
And
that was the point I was making about the arbitrariness of a phone book. That it's alphabetical, it's bounded by geography, it's bounded by who registered a telephone line when, and just all of these different things that you could, I think, in their accumulation, it starts to seem random from a sufficient remove. But it also, if you zoom into one thing, alphabetical order is not random. It's arbitrary.
But the numbers.
But again, so I think the use of the numbers is random, following that. Exactly. But I think Daniel did make a good point about thinking of like, oh wait, yeah, it is random in the context of art making, but it is not in, let's say, geopolitical context, maybe.
So where does one find a phone book these days to research this? The library.
All right, I one last? Oh, one more question. Same beret wearing. Thank you, Roxanne.
Yeah, I have the last one. I'm sorry. Could you tell us if François Morellet and also his work with the graph has inspired the young generation of artists, and what could be the legacy of François Morellet today, please?
In conjunction specifically with Grave, with his gravures?
I mean his work, his individual work, but also if when he was working with the Grave, they inspired some artists.
I mean, I could tell you anecdotally, the way that I got to Grave was through my research on conceptual art, and Daniel Buren said he was following Grave very carefully in the 1960s. It's very interesting that Grave is writing manifestos, and Buren and BMPT start writing manifestos later in the 1960s and into the 1970s. And then another thing that came up, young artists who are no longer young, right? I mean, Daniel Buren. Another thing that came up of another young artist who's no longer young is Hans Haka's the pieces, the questionnaires. He said he was following what Grave was doing with the questionnaires, and then by the late 60s, he's developing questionnaires as well. So the legacies are there, and now, so then there'd be the legacies of the legacies that we're kind of getting to, which is interesting.
And hopefully our exhibition is working towards, in all those events, to create a new legacy with younger artists. Well,
I just have one point. I think the legacy that we see is the continuation of collective art practice, and it manifests differently now. Some of the manifestations are cross-national over different modes of communication, but there are a lot of artists that are continuing on, and that's just not just Grave, it's a 60s spirit, but I feel like that the constant rebirth of the collective it's born in that time. I mean, it's born in many times, but for me, that's their legacy that it is, and also art is experience. It's also born in the 60s, not uniquely Grave, but the idea that it's a word that they actually even used in some of the texts for the instability show in Buenos Aires, that was in the catalog. Art is experience and art is collective and art is social, all of that's born in that time, and they were a part of that. Just even hearing what Alex just said about the immediate, almost even generationally even, artists, I think that's a legacy that you could pin on a lot of people. So that's what I would say.
Excellent. Well, thank you to you three very much, and thank you for attending.